Chapter 326. Petty Gossip. After the retirement of Bruno's father, both from politics and the family business, his children had replaced him in both regards. In the theater of politics, his son Ludwig had taken over the patriarch of the house's role. But when it came to the family business, the eldest son of the family and presumed heir of the house had been granted that privilege. Franz, however, was a man known for spending most of his time abroad operating as a glorified salesman. Stay connected via freeweb novel. And in doing so, leaving control over the company's day-to-day operations to his younger brother Christoph. Christoph, being the second oldest of Bruno's brothers, had little interaction with our protagonist when he was very little. Because of this, their bond as brothers was not the strongest. But while the man held no real love for his youngest sibling, he also had no animosity towards him. Bruno was a pillar of the house, and sure, there had been some controversy early on with his morganatic marriage, but these matters had long since been settled. By Bruno's own hand, he had made his wife a legitimate princess, and recently a step above with the title Grand Princess. Sure, these were foreign titles, and one of them was quite literally landed, but in the world of nobility that didn't actually matter. The title itself was what was valuable, not where one might be a prince or princess from. Hence why Heidi's new position needed to be respected above everything else. She was quite literally of a noble house now, and not just married into one, but helped found one with Heidi as the wife of its head. That, of course, being the recently established branch of the von Zehntner family Bruno established in Transylvania to distinguish his line of succession from his father's. This, of course, created some minor difficulties for Christoph as he now needed to treat his youngest brother as a superior. Something that he had no personal qualms with, as he had enough self-awareness to recognize how exceptional Bruno's deeds had been in life, and how much more valuable the man was to the German Reich than himself. But Christoph's wife, on the other hand, did not like the idea of bowing her head to the bastard princess of Transylvania. A nickname that only dared to be uttered by the petty and jealous hags who conceived it in private. Even their husbands were not privy to the title they had bestowed upon Heidi, whom they held so much contempt for, if not simply because she shined much brighter than their own mediocrity, despite being of lower birth. Humans were, after all, tribalistic by nature, and astonishingly could form a tribal identity from just about anything. Whether that be the family they were related to, the nation they were born into, the religion they chose to follow, or sometimes even their favorite sports team. One could simply observe human behavior and be astounded at all the nonsense that came from it if they simply sat by and watched long enough. And if they were to do so, they would notice a peculiar phenomenon where the most mediocre of a tribal identity would often claim to be of a superior status in life because of the collective achievements of their tribe, rather than anything they had personally accomplished. It was quite common in nearly every tribe or community that was formed, and thus it made sense that the most mediocre of women among the European nobility would proclaim themselves superior to Heidi, not because of their personal deeds or merit, but because they were born into the right tribal group, that being their own noble households. Naturally, these pathetic wretches were gossiping in the living room of Christoph's own home, with his wife being host to the rabble. And their gossip was of the news regarding Alya's recent threats to her own flock of hens. Have you heard the most recent news regarding that family? Poor dear, she has chosen to marry her eldest son, the heir to their princely household, to some poor little orphan girl from Russia. I suppose, being ill-bred herself, she must have sympathy for such little tramps. It isn't surprising that the Russian girl lashed out at her friends for commenting on how peculiar her engagement is to the prince. These old hags were not actually all that concerned about the age gap between Alya and her future husband. They could not care less about such things, as several of them were already involved in illicit affairs with much younger men than themselves. Rather, where they found fault with Alya was the fact that a low-born orphan girl was marrying the heir to a line of grand princes. And for a matter that had nothing to do with them, it simply made them seethe. Though Christoph's wife had not heard of this news until now, as her family was not particularly close to Bruno's except for sharing the same last name, she acted as if she did, nodding her head and adding her comments on it. Quite the scandal indeed. Considering she helped raise the little Russian urchin, I suppose this is why we call her the bastard princess of Transylvania, no? She then immediately returned to sipping her tea, her eyes bulging open in shock when she saw her husband standing behind her friend who had dared to open her mouth about the subject. The man was staring at his own wife as if he was going to murder her, and the tone when he spoke matched such a sentiment. What in the hell did I just walk into? When you say the bastard princess of Transylvania, you are not speaking about my sister-in-law, are you? All eyes were set upon Christoph, who, for the most part, was considered a far more honorable man than his elder brother. And when the women saw the sheer rage on the man's face, they instantly became pale and petrified. Not a single one of them dared to speak as Christoph aggressively approached them, all the while demanding answers. Speak now, or I will have you a lot of pathetic witches cast from my home for this grave insult against my family. Chapter 327, Dead and Buried Part 1. Christoph was not a fool. He was aware that Bruno's rapid rise to prominence both in the Imperial German army and among the aristocratic class had made him many detractors. It was an obvious inevitability, one that Christoph already suspected Bruno was already well aware of himself. After all, humans were petty and vain creatures, and those who rose to the top via their own merits would always be chastised and spat upon by the incompetent, the mediocre, and God forbid those who gained their position through nepotism. But Bruno had gained the Kaiser's favor, and because of this, nobody had the balls to openly say anything about the man. They would only whisper among those whose ears they knew were friendly, and even then, they would take more than a few glances around to make sure that no prying eyes were lurking around the corner. The more Bruno shot to the top, the more he would be despised by the old guard of the aristocratic class, especially when he was challenging certain social norms. For the most part, Bruno was a staunch traditionalist and a large supporter of the monarchy and the institution of nobility in general. However, there were some things he felt were impractical and needed to evolve with the times. For starters, the idea that noble families should only marry in their own social class. This had caused long-term genetic defects in many of the noble households, especially the older ones. The rich veins of those whose ancestors had risen to their positions in a time of strife and bloodshed had initially made the knights, lords, and kings the most genetically gifted families, as the exceptional rose to the top and produced exceptional children. But over time, without fresh new blood to be pumped through the veins of these ancient lineages, they would ultimately rot and decay from inbreeding. This was one of the many reasons Bruno was more than happy to marry his eldest son off to a Russian commoner. However, this was also something that many looked down upon, especially since Bruno's family was relatively recently established as nobility. Marrying his heir off to a commoner meant that he was depriving another noble house of that honor, and this made more than a few powerful figures resentful towards Bruno's familial practices. Ultimately, this was not something that Christoph perceived to be an issue that he was required to get involved with. He was after all not in his youngest brother's position, nor was he particularly close to the man. In fact, he would only do something of the matter if he either personally witnessed it, or he heard of something that may perhaps be considered a threat. Unfortunately, because he had walked in on his wife and her friends at the wrong time, while they were in the midst of gossiping about Bruno's family, Christoph was now in a place and position where he needed to confront the slander being cast towards his own bloodline. After all, Bruno's rise had brought his own family and the rest who shared his surname to a far greater prominence than they already had. Whether it was the number of military orders they were receiving or invitations to important social events. The von Zehntner family had become a household name within the German Reich, and Bruno had even rewarded several of his family members with shares in many of his corporations. Christoph himself held a 5% share in Bruno's personal bank that was being used to counter the interests of those who sought to further destabilize the German Reich. Not that anyone really knew this purpose for its existence other than the owner himself. And recently there were talks of officially recognizing the main line of the von Zehntner family as counts for the contributions that multiple generations of their family had made to the Kingdom of Prussia and the German Reich over the years. This would officially place them in the high nobility and would give them some face, considering the youngest member of their main family line was now a prince in Russia and the Grand Prince of Transylvania. With all of this in mind, Christoph was now obligated to chastise these women who were staring at him with dread and rebuke his wife thoroughly in front of them. After all, She had the shame to go along with these bitches and their slanderous words towards her own family. The time frame Christoph had given to these highborn ladies to recant their remarks was quickly passing, all the while he stared at them with fury in his eyes and curled fists. His face had practically turned red with rage. Not particularly because of what they had said, but because they had the audacity to say it in his home, and his wife of all people helped facilitate it, rather than shut it down. It was truly a black mark on his immediate family's reputation, and if word got out to his brothers, his stock in the house would drop drastically. Perhaps because one of these ladies was a countess, she felt that she was entitled to do as she said in this humble home of a junker's second son, and was quick to lash out at Christoph for what he had said to her just moments before. My word, I don't believe I have ever met a man with such an ego as to tell me, a countess, that he will personally cast me out of his home. Touch me if you dare. Slap. The sound that echoed as Christoph's hand smacked the absolute shit out of the highborn lady's cheek resounded across the room, as if a bolt of lightning had gone off nearby in the immediate vicinity. And the shock that it had stirred was no less stunning in nature. Neither Christoph's wife nor her other friends could believe that the man had just struck the wife of a count. Nor could the woman in question, as her reddened cheek stung with agony. Tears quickly followed as they washed away the extensive makeup which was caked on the hag's face, quickly revealing the wrinkles she had so desperately tried to hide as she stared at Christoph with the devil in her eyes, all the while conjuring his voice in the loudest and most vicious shriek the man had ever heard in his life. You dare strike me? You knave! I will have my husband know of this insult. Christoph was undeterred as he heard this and hollered at the woman with bravado as she stormed out of the house. Go and tell your cuckold of a husband what I have done. I dare you. I will have him lying dead in the yard within a fortnight if he has the fortitude to challenge me over your lack of honor. You up-jumped harlot. After saying this, Christoph stared at the other women who were enjoying the show as if it were some grand theater. Only after they saw the sheer hatred in his blue eyes did they realize they had messed up, and they were quick to scatter before he could do the same to them. Only after all of his wife's friends were gone did Christoph lecture the woman personally, as he told her exactly what she thought of her. Are you so desperate for the approval of those floozies that you must tarnish the reputation of your own family? Let me make something abundantly clear to you, woman, since you don't seem to understand. I am not as passive as you believe me to be, and if I find out you have been engaging in the same nocturnal activities as those hussies, I will see to it that your body is never discovered. Do you understand me? There was nothing that Christoph's wife could say to calm the man's fury, and she remained utterly silent until he began to walk up their staircase. And when he did, the woman called out to him, And just what are you going to do about Claudia? You do understand that her husband is a very powerful and wealthy man. For striking her, he could easily have you arrested. Christoph did not say a word to his wife at first. Instead, he continued to climb the stairs. It was only after he came back to the staircase with a wooden case did he finally speak. Read exclusive chapters at Freeweb Novel. As I said to that whore you call your friend, if her husband has the stones to demand satisfaction from me, we will handle this the old way. Laws be damned, I will have him dead and buried in my yard within a fortnight at the latest. After saying this, Christoph opened the wooden chest to reveal 2 dueling pistols that were entirely unique. They were a set of one, designed specifically for his own entertainment. Breech-loading pistols chambered in the American .4570 government. These pistols had rifles, barrels, and a blued steel finish with gold damascene inlays, as well as ivory pistol grips. They were as beautiful as they were deadly. And when Christoph's wife saw this, she damn near freaked out at him. But the man simply loaded a .4570 round into the breech and shut it closed, the very act of which terrified the woman into total silence. And when he turned his head around to look at her, there was no emotion on his face as Christoph spoke the words that sent chills down his wife's spine. You were saying? Chapter 328, Dead and Buried Part 2. Franz von Zehntner was the heir apparent to his family, the eldest child and official head of the family business. However, he was a hedonistic man who spent most of his free time gallivanting overseas with exotic women. Maximilian, the wastrel of the von Zehntner family, was in the process of redemption. Though his exile from the house had yet to be revoked, his actions as an agent of the crown and a royal shit stirrer on behalf of the Kaiser, had gone a long way towards gaining his father's forgiveness. Ludwig was a proud member of the Bundesrat and a leader among those within the Land, Army, and Fortresses Committee. He was considered the man to succeed the head of their house as he entered his twilight years as a politician representing the interests of the Juncker coalition, the German Conservative Party, and of course the other right-wing political parties which rallied behind their majority control of the empire. Kurt had gone on to become a doctor following his stint as a military medic within the Iron Division during the Russian Civil War. He was critical in helping Heidi set up her charitable foundations which provided much-needed relief and services to those soldiers wounded during the war and the burdens their family would ultimately have to bear because of it. Excluding Bruno and Christoph, there were 3 other brothers, all of which were pursuing their own feats in life, with one of them becoming the world's first Olympics gold medalist in both boxing and freestyle wrestling, while another was a talented actor within the propaganda films that Bruno's Cinema Corporation were producing to galvanize the German people against a world of enemies. Recently, the man had starred in a film about Waterloo where he interestingly enough played the role of his grandfather, a colonel in the Prussian army, as he courageously led his men to glory over the French and earned an Iron Cross first and second class because of it. And finally, one of the brothers actually had moved to Vienna, where he had become quite the well-renowned composer regularly performing within its legendary opera hall. Meanwhile, Bruno, the youngest of the siblings, was loyal to folk and fatherland. Because of this, he was usually either found at his home protecting his family, or at war protecting the Reich from its enemies. Out of all the brothers, each and every one of them were at the peak of their own areas of expertise in life. And then there was Christoph. Who was Christoph? He was second in command at the family business, officially behind Franz, but in reality was the man keeping everything together. He was the secret hand that kept the family's business functioning, and he was the socialite who maintained constant relations with the aristocratic class within informal settings. Perhaps because of this, he took the family's reputation and honor far more seriously than anyone else. Any one of his siblings, except for Maximilian, who had been cast out and exiled for his own scandalous behavior during his younger years, who would be slandered or defamed, Christoph would step forward to defend in the court of public opinion. It was because he had performed this role for so many years that he now ignored things said behind his back and would only approach someone if he happened to hear it personally. Because of this, he had slapped the wife of an influential count. In addition to this, the woman was quick to relay the words that Christoph had said to her regarding the opinion the man had of her husband. Being a cuckold, or simply even being labeled such a thing, true or not, was a serious insult to any man's honor. Was this count aware of his wife's infidelity and her affairs? Perhaps, or perhaps not. But could he tolerate being called something of the sort and not retaliate? Most certainly not. To do so would not only ruin his own standing in society, but that of his family. Because of this, he found himself seeking out Christoph, fully aware of his challenge, but naive or foolish enough to believe it having been made as a mere intimidation tactic. Thus, when he showed up at Christoph's home, he was surprised to see that the mere second son of a junker had not prepared a grand entrance for him, nor was there anyone sent to receive him. The guards actually patted the man down and prevented his aide from entering the villa, which was an even graver insult to him. And when he found Christoph standing in front of the window with his hands held behind his back, gazing out into the courtyard below, he was astonished to find the 2 pistols sitting on the table, crossed. Before the count could speak, Christoph raised his tone. Traditionally, it is the right of the challenged to choose the weapon in which the duel is conducted. But we no longer live in such a time where the old ways are honored. Duels have long since become illegal, and in the eyes of many within our esteemed class, a laughable affair. But I'm not some prissy little lordling who sits on his ancestors' throne abusing his house's power that were built by greater men. I am not the kind to write an appeal to the court to sue your wife for defamatory. You see, my house was built through blood and iron. All that you see was gained through service to the fatherland, and through the willingness to kill and die for every inch of soil we have. An insult was given under my own roof to a member of my own family. Beloved or not, this cannot stand. The way I see it, you have 2 options: kneel before me and condemn your wife for her remarks while begging for my forgiveness, or take up one of those pistols and show me whether or not you are worthy to bear your ancestors' name. Mark my words, Your Excellency. Satisfaction will be had, and you will not leave this house until I have had it. God willing, you will leave this place alive. If not, well, there is a place for you to be buried in the yard, as you can see." The man gazed past Christophe's shoulder and looked in abject horror as he saw the villa's servants digging a hole in the ground. It took him a few moments to recompose himself, where he began to plead for a more sensible solution, asserting his own grievances as he did so. "You speak as if you are the only one who has been insulted. My wife says you call me a cuckold. Since we have both been slandered here, is it not wise to seek some form of compromise?" Christophe finally turned around from the table and gazed upon the Count with a smug smirk on his face, one that suggested he knew far more than he had stated prior, but was only willing to reveal now. Perhaps as a means of provoking the man to accept his duel, an illegal contest that would certainly constitute murder if word got out. Nevertheless, the way which Christophe chose to speak was deliberately provocative. "Oh, but nothing I said was untrue, now was it? Defamation of character requires a lie to be stated, and I can prove that your wife is having an affair with a man half your age. In fact, I can also verify in a court of law that you were aware of such a thing and permit it to exist." After saying this, Christophe reached into a nearby folder that was lying on the glass table next to the pistols, where he opened it up and revealed its contents. Inside were photographs taken inside the Count's own home, of his wife being physically involved with another man while he watched. The look on the Count's face was truly something Christophe wished he could have photographed, and because the man was so shocked at its contents, he was quick to stammer before becoming outright furious. "Ho, how in the holy hell did you get these?" Christophe sneered as he commented on the man's naivety, only further provoking him into making a mistake which would be his last. "I run extensive background checks on anyone my family comes into contact with, including those friends of my wife. As for precisely how I manage this, well, one of my youngest brother's corporations has made great gains in developing small handheld cameras for use in intelligence operations. And well, let's just say your staff is not nearly as loyal to your house as they would have you believe. The price was rather cheap to convince one of your maids to snap a few photos of the debauchery your wife, and you get up to behind the scenes. So how about it? Do you wish to take me up on my offer? I can assure you, if you kill me in this duel and destroy those photos, there will be no evidence left to condemn you." The Count, perhaps being driven beyond the point of reason, was quick to strip off his tie and jacket, where he boldly accepted Christophe's offer to have a duel with pistols at 10 paces in the courtyard, all while having a malevolent smirk on his face. "You know, I don't know why dueling ever fell out of fashion, because I think I'm really going to enjoy this." Chapter 329, Dead and Buried Part 3. Christophe and the Count met outside the villa well within the courtyard's grounds. Considering they were far enough away from the city within the Prussian countryside, and there was an actual shooting range built into Christophe's estate, much like his father's where he grew up during his early years, it would not be the least bit suspicious if a gunshot or two went off at this time of day. The sun was bright, and the sky was clear, while the weather was warm, but not overly hot. It was a fine spring afternoon, and a most surely an ideal day for a duel. Tradition had been ignored, as it would normally be the Count's right as the challenge to pick the method of the duel. He would also normally have a second to vouch that this event had occurred. But such days were long past, and this little squabble of theirs was most certainly illegal. Thus, the honorable traditions of a bygone era were not granted at this time. No, this was a way for two men with animosity towards one another to settle their grievances without resorting to bludgeoning each other with their fists like savages, nor petitioning the court to listen to their bickering like men who lacked a pair of testicles between their legs. Each man was issued a pistol, a breech-loading weapon designed by Bruno von Zehntner and masterfully crafted with the most advanced steel-making technique known to man. The barrels were button-rifled to an ideal twist rate and were manufactured from modern 4150 chrome molybdenum steel, while the receiver was forged of sterner stuff, ideal for long-term abuse and rigidity. The breakaway action was quick, tactile, ambidextrous, and robust enough to handle the extensive power of the .4570 handloads that Christophe had personally crafted for his own use on the range. The man fancied the extensively powerful rifle round that in a bit of comedic marketing would be officially rated to take down a Tyrannosaurus Rex in promotional material for a popular move franchise rebooted sometimes during the 2010s of Bruno's past life. It was, of course, powerful enough to do so in its non-magnum format. The rounds loaded into these pistols were, of course, hollow-point ammunition. After ensuring that their weapons were properly loaded and were primed to fire, Christophe briefly went over the rules with his opponent before they took their places on the courtyard in front of a solid gold statue dedicated to an obscure ancient Greek goddess that Christophe had personally commissioned as he fancied the mythology of the ancient world. The rules are simple. We take 10 steps in opposing directions, turn around, and fire our shot. If both of us are still standing at the end, we will consider it a draw. Fair? Seeing how Christophe was not going to force the man to continue with this farce until one of them was dead, the Count was quick to sigh in relief. That is, until an important question was triggered within his mind. And what happens if this little contest of ours results in a draw? Christophe smirked. He was an expert marksman, a former Jaeger officer whose qualifications with pistols and rifles were at the peak of military excellency. And he had been training with this massive breech-loading pistol for some time now. One whose breakneck recoil was more than enough to cause serious bodily harm to a lesser man, who might end up snapping himself in the face with it. Nevertheless, he answered the Count by telling him exactly what he wanted to hear before sinisterly stepping towards his starting position. I'll consider it my loss, and our matters will settle once and for all. As a result, any evidence I have of your extracurricular activities will be burned in front of your eyes, and I will treat it as if I had never seen it. Fair. The Count was quick to agree to these terms. The pistol was heavy, far heavier than he imagined it would be. He doubted anyone could reliably fire off a shot at short notice and actually hit their target even at 10 paces out. Because of this, he was confident this would be his win as he took his starting position. The referee of this contest was the head of Christophe's house staff, who began the countdown. You may proceed. The Count had his back to Christophe, as Christophe had his back turned to him and had begun taking his steps. With each movement of his feet, he felt as if his heart was about to explode from the overwhelming pounding that was resounding in his ears. It was so loud that after the third step, he had hardly heard the premature gunfire which echoed across the vicinity. At first, he thought perhaps he was hearing things, until he realized there was a massive hole in his chest, causing him to gaze in shock as he fell to the ground, tumbling over into a position where his vision quickly began to fade. The last thing he could see was Christophe walking towards him, ejecting the spent cartridge from his breech loader with particularly joyful gait in his step, along with a devilish grin on his face. After which he bent over and collected the man's own pistol, which Christophe had given him for the sake of the duel, and began the process of clearing it, and cleaning it without a second thought to the man who was rapidly fading away beneath his feet. And finally, there was utter darkness. The last thought the Count had was, why? Christophe's servants immediately began to dispose of the body, while the referee shook his head and clicked his tongue while voicing his disapproval. Of all the unsportsmanlike conduct I have seen in my life, this has got to be by far the most dishonorable. Really, Master Christophe? This is how you wish to behave during your first duel. The head of Christophe's staff was a generational servant of the von Zehntner family. He had been around long enough to personally witness the splendor of duels fought within the household. He had also seen the practice outlawed and disappear entirely. For this to be the last duel he would ever witness in his life, Christophe's actions were nothing short of distasteful. However, it was the words he spoke after being called out on this dishonorable behavior that would perhaps haunt the aging specter most of all. Honor is the prize of a fool, Walter. The dead have no use for glory. You think your fanciful ideals of honor win wars or protect the family legacy? No, it is iron and blood. It has always been this way. You who have never served in the army and have been at my family's side as a mere servant since the day you were born have only ever seen the vain trappings of chivalry we noblemen put on as a display to maintain the facade that we are more than mere killers. Every single nobleman worth his salt rose to his position because he was damn good at killing his monarch's enemies. I was not going to leave this matter to mere chance. He had to die today, and soon rumor will spread that the last place he was spotted before he went missing was my home. They won't find a body. The age of industry and science has made disposing of such things quite easy for those who possess the knowledge, wealth, and means to do so. But there will always be a reminder that the Count disappeared after his wife had insulted my family. And that should remind these cretins who have been resting on the laurels of better men for far too long that my family is still too young to tolerate such things without resorting to force as a means of retaliation and violence. Walter is the supreme force in this world, of which all other means of authority are derived. If you want to send a message, it's best to make it a bloody spectacle. Nobody will ever forget such a thing, even if they can't prove you did it. Now come, these priceless pistols aren't going to clean themselves, now are they? Christophe did not say another word after this. The Count's body would be dragged off by his men, where it would be dissolved in acid and buried in a barrel in some random plot of public land, deep enough never to be disturbed. As for the blood that stained the earth within Christophe's estate, it would seem that God had shown his favor to the von Zehntner family on this day, as an unusual storm broke out over the outskirts of Berlin shortly thereafter, washing away any trace of what had happened this day, whether that be gunpowder residue, blood, or sinew. Thus, the silent guardian of the von Zehntner family, and the most inconspicuous of his siblings, went back to performing his day job, which was operating the family business on his elder brother's behalf. And as Christophe suspected, things would suddenly become very quiet after that regarding any less than desirable rumors that may have been spreading about Bruno's family, almost as if one were to speak ill of them. Even within closed doors among close friends, they would be inviting the devil into their midst. Chapter 330, Simple Man. The war in Italy had barely moved beyond the initial borders. Not because Bruno and his men were sustaining losses, rather they were waiting for their allies to catch up to them. And because of this, Bruno was currently watching through the trenches dressed in his greatcoat, while having one of the new infantry rifles slung across his back. By now, the bodies of the deceased had been cleared, and the engineers had begun restoring the border fortifications as they should have been. Despite being given the advantage, Bruno did not press the attack. He needed his allies to continue their advance from their own sides, and because of this, he did not move beyond them, for to do so would most certainly risk encirclement and defeat. As a result, Bruno had watched as his men spent their time waiting for the orders to move. Rain poured down from the sky, and yet the soldiers of the 8th Army, consisting by now entirely of the most battle-hardened veterans of its previous organization, stood still. Artillery echoed in the distance from other battles taking place nearby, and machine guns fired off at every given moment of the day and night. Yet the men beneath Bruno's command did not twitch in the slightest. 2 years of war in the Balkans for all the enlisted men had made them hard enough to endure what needed to be done, while the NCOs and officers above them had been by Bruno's side since the Russian Civil War. It was an organization as well established as an armed fighting force could be, and the 8th Army had even unofficially adopted their own unit insignia as a way to distinguish themselves from their peers. The uniforms which these soldiers wore were, as a result, altered by adding the new emblem of the German 8th Army onto the left biceps of its tunic and greatcoat. This insignia was a shield that contained a black corner and a red corner separated by a white diagonal stripe. It was the same decal used by the Wehrmacht during the Second World War of Bruno's past life. However, there was one change to this symbol, and that was the addition of the Iron Division's infamous Totenkopf, which was emblazoned within the center of the logo, a striking addition to any German uniform, which struck fear into the hearts of those who saw them. As a result, even Bruno's uniform contained this slight modification despite the fact that it was not an approved addition to a soldier's field attire. Yet, even so, if he were to be interrogated over the matter, he would argue that this new symbol was a sign of camaraderie and heritage within the unit he commanded, one that increased morale on the battlefield. Thus, when Bruno walked in the trenches, he did so in a uniform without any form of embellishment and a helmet that matched the others. His greatcoat was the same as every other soldier in the army. No medals, nor embroidery to speak of, and he walked alone among his men with his rifle slung like the rest of them. To any sniper who was not already intimately aware of his appearance, he was just another soldier. As such, Bruno liked to personally inspect the troops and what they were doing when he had the time to do so. And currently he was doing just that, as a group of soldiers laid their backs against the trench wall, smoking while their machine gunner was on his weapon, whose bipod was deployed at the edge of the barrier. He was as vigilant as could be. But at times like this, when nothing was happening, the rest of the men in his squad were more or less on standby. Because of this, the machine gunner did not react to Bruno approaching him, especially after Bruno put his finger to his lips and silently made sure the rest of the men did not mention his presence. After doing so, he approached the machine gunner and asked one simple question, not even trying to conceal his voice as he did so. "So, how does it look out there?" The machine gunner, maintaining his focus on the front, as his experience by now had given him perfect discipline, did not even look at Bruno as he answered the question honestly, not knowing that the man in charge of the entire 8th Army had been the one to pose it. "Honestly, fucking nothing, not a single sign of hostiles, and I mean nothing, no snipers, no forward observers. There has been no movement for the last 5 fucking hours, and I tell you one thing, my vision is hardwired for that shit. Trust me, if even a fucking squirrel moves in a bush, I would instantly notice it. And there is nothing out there." Bruno chuckled as he heard the man say this, before giving him a command that nobody who was watching the scene unfold was expecting. "You're relieved? I'll take over from here." The man sighed, his shoulders relaxing as he carefully placed the machine gun's safety into a position that would prevent the weapon from firing before stretching his arms and back, all while griping about the job he had. "Thank fucking God. If I was forced to keep watch for another hour or two, I swear to God I would have." The man turned suddenly silent and went pale as he shifted around to see who exactly he was complaining to. Bruno was as stoic as could be as he hunkered down into a position that prevented his head from being exposed to potential sniper fire as much as possible while he mounted the machine gun, taking over the soldier's position on watch, giving only a single statement of assurance as he did so. "Enjoy your rest. I'll see you in the morning." The soldiers near Bruno's side did not even complain about their machine gunner being granted a sudden reprieve only for his position to be taken over by their general. Instead, they were more alert than ever. All the while the machine gunner was baffled but ended up stumbling out of the area and towards the bunkers where the cots were laid out as if he had just had a conversation with Jesus Christ himself. Once he was gone, the soldiers in the machine gunner's squad were silently motioning towards one another. They had so many questions for the man, the myth, the legend who was in charge of their army. A man none of them had ever actually spoken to before now. And yet they were also aware that they were currently in charge of his safety, silently debating what to say, how to say it, or if they should say it at all. Bruno finally sighed and chastised the men for their hesitancy. "If you have something to say, just say it. You're acting like a bunch of timid schoolgirls. You are men, aren't you? You've spilled blood on my orders, yes? Then say what needs to be said with conviction like you have a pair of balls. Or are you all women in disguise as soldiers?" Seeing how the general of their army had not chastised the machine gunner for his crass and casual language, and was even willing to bust their balls as if he was one of them, the men suddenly became both jovial and alert as they began taking up their rifles to stand next to Bruno as they began to converse with him. Throughout the night, Bruno would stand on watch with the men beneath his command and chat about all sorts of things with the squad. Time and again, they tried to get him to go back and get some sleep whenever they felt worried about him, to which Bruno would assert that would not happen until he had fulfilled his promise to the machine gunner. By the end of the night, they felt as if the near superhuman mystique that surrounded their commander had faded, and that in reality, he was not some Greek legend manifested in the flesh, but rather was a simple man, just like the rest of them. Almost like a father figure who was doing everything he could both to keep them alive and crush the enemy at the same time. Word would spread of Bruno's actions and further humanize him among his own army, something that other generals of the era would have a hard time understanding. It was not until dawn that the squad's full relief came, and Bruno returned to his personal quarters, where he was awoken at noon of the next day by Heinrich, who asked him a question that Bruno couldn't help but scoff at. "You spent the night on watch again, didn't you?" Bruno's response was one of denial as he began to dress in his uniform as preparation for the work that would need to be done on this day. "Me? I'm a general feldmarshal. Why on earth would I do such a thing? Don't I have men to do that for me?" Even though Bruno denied it, his smug smirk and the tone of his voice were all the admission that Heinrich needed to understand the truth of the matter. prompting him to holler off to Bruno, who was headed towards the mess area of the trench complex. "I get that the men need their rest, but you do too, sir. You should seriously rethink this habit of yours." Bruno, of course, waved Heinrich off. He knew exactly what he was doing. His legend had grown so great that it was beginning to overshadow the man he really was, even among his own soldiers. And if he wanted their loyalty and respect, they needed reminders every now and then that Bruno was not some godlike figure who could not be bothered to care for the lives mere mortals like them. No, he was in the shit, just like the rest of them, and their survival was a major concern of his, as was his own. And when they remembered that, they would also remember why they would follow this man to hell and back, even if he never asked them to. Chapter 331, The Price of a Mile Revisited. The invasion of Luxembourg and its surrounding areas had resulted in relatively minor gains. However, complete and total disaster had been averted in the process. Charles de Gaulle, for saving the 1 million Allied men who damn near walked into one of the worst traps in modern military history, had been awarded not only with a promotion to the French equivalent of brigadier general, but also had been given several decorations for the act. Even so, the man could not help but gaze upon the piles and piles of bodies which the Allied High Command had thrown at the problem. The German lines in Alsace-Lothringen had held firm. Every attempt to gain a minor amount of ground had been thoroughly rebuffed and cost a significant amount of lives in the process. But southern Belgium was a fortress that was slowly being chipped away at by the Allied forces. With Luxembourg held by the Allies, they could bring reinforcements into the region to attack critical areas from a variety of angles. It also wasn't nearly as fortified as German territory had been. After all, the Germans had built defenses on the fly within Belgium, whereas they had 10 years to prepare within Alsace-Lothringen. Even so, the price of a mile gained in Belgium was steep, so much so that Charles de Gaulle thought it was not remotely worth the expense. Currently, the spring showers were falling upon the fields outside of a Belgian village, near the southern border of the nation. Charles could hear the repeated pings resulting from the droplets glancing off of his steel helmet. It was an innocuous sound, but when one was already in a pitiful mood, it was also the only thing they could focus on. A cigarette lay within the man's mouth as he took a long drag, while gazing upon the freshest crop of bodies to be returned from the front lines. The Germans had dug into the village and had propped themselves up with flak guns and anti-tank guns alongside their far more effective machine guns. Every attempt the Allies had made to break through with their Mk2 tanks had resulted in abject failure. But worse yet was the fact that the Germans had begun ambushing them with small unit tactics. The soldiers of the German army, more specifically their elite Jaeger light infantry, would move behind enemy lines with machine guns, lightweight mortars, automatic rifles, and worse yet, mobile anti-tank rifles. The GRB-39 anti-tank rifle had proven exceptional in regards to inflicting casualties upon Allied troops. A single anti-tank grenade launched from its firing adapter was more than enough to disable a Mk2 tank, and the automatic weapons employed by the rest of the German squad members would wipe out the crews desperately trying to eject from the devastated vehicles. Even armored columns proved susceptible to the tactics used by the German Jaegers. And because of this, Charles had begun to suspect that the Germans were not only employing advanced weaponry against the Allied armies, but they were also using significantly more developed communications technology. There was no other way to describe how the Germans constantly knew where they were and how best to hit them. Every engagement the Allies had with the enemy, they were effectively known in advance and blown out of the water by the German army. This was quickly proving to be a disastrous military campaign of the most epic proportions, and Charles de Gaulle could only admit that the man who had made such extensive preparations knew warfare at a level so advanced he could actively predict how future conflicts would be fought. The rapid advance of the German Eighth Army in the Balkans and Italy proved this to be true. Thus, as the French general stood in the rain, gazing upon his dead forces, he had to admit, France was truly being bested by a military mastermind. As a general, Charles knew the reality of the war and its casualty statistics, or at least as best as the Allies could account for them. The public might suspect things were not going the way they wished, but if this information got out, the war would be over in a fortnight. Thus, it was a tightly guarded secret that the Central Powers had inflicted 10 times the casualties on the Allied forces than they had sustained thus far. And if one were only counting those between Germany and France, the ratio was easily 25-1. Though Charles could never admit it aloud, the man who had devised the defensive strategy currently being employed by the German army had a single purpose when he made it: to bleed France dry of its manpower and resources. This was a conflict designed to make France lose so many men and to spend so much money on the war that they would not be able to wage another against Germany for the foreseeable future. And only Charles appeared to have understood this fact. If it were not for the fact that the German leadership seemed to be in competition with one another to see who could gain the most glory, then Luxembourg would have never been retaken by the Allies, and 1,000,000 men would currently lie dead at its border. If he dared to utter this fact to his superiors, Charles would be castigated for spreading defeatist sentiment, something that had in recent months become among the most severe crimes one could commit within the ranks of the French army. But as the war continued to wage, and France's men continued to die by the masses, Charles would only further hold the Republic and its civilian leadership responsible for the vicious losses they had sustained during the Great War. A sentiment that, if left unchecked, could forever change the result of the timeline. But that was a matter Bruno would have to deal with in time, as his current focus was set on forcing an end to the war in Italy, something that he would now have the means to do as his allies finally caught up to his initial advance. Chapter 332. Introduction of Russian Armor Part 1. Tsar Nicholas II stood within the hallowed steps of his family's luxurious palace. He was dressed in full ceremonial regalia, as he gazed upon the painting commissioned by one of his court artisans. The piece depicted Bruno in almost saint-like light. Wearing his Russian field marshal uniform with full honors, which he had been granted, Bruno was clutching a Fedorov avtomat to one arm, while holding a Russian Orthodox Bible within the same hand which the rifle was shouldered. As for his free hand, it was held up in a religious position with Orthodox prayer beads dangling from it. The aura of light raining down on him, and the saintly circle behind his head did little to hide the fact of the veneration which the House of Romanov had to their great protector. Passing by the painting which Nicholas was inspecting with a satisfied smirk on his face was his youngest daughter, Anastasia. The painting depicted Bruno in his younger years, as he was when he first met the Russian Tsar. And Anastasia was just a little girl back then, barely able to remember the sight of the Red Scourge who had devastated the Bolshevik Party and their other Marxist allies in a brutal civil war of extermination. Even so, she knew exactly who Bruno was, not only from the handful of times she had met him since, but as well as the fact that his face was constantly in the papers. However, most notable of all was the fact that while she was growing up beside her oldest sister, the girl was constantly gushing on about the man, and even secretly wore a necklace which concealed a photo inside of it for many years. Anastasia's remarks on the painting, which was photorealistic and depicted a much younger version of Bruno, displayed her shock at how little he had aged over the years. "Father, is that really how he appeared all those years ago during the war? I saw his appearance in the paper last week. He does not look a decade older in the slightest." Nicholas sighed before glancing towards his daughter with a stern gaze. He was quick to lay down the law with her, as he had failed to do with Olga years prior. "Anastasia, if you are remotely even developing feelings for the man, I will put my foot down right now. I tolerated your sister's infatuation with my dear friend for a while, because I thought they were just passing fancies of a young girl. But I will not have you end up heartbroken like her when you realize that your dreams will not remotely come true." The young Russian Grand Duchess was quick to correct her father's misunderstandings, as she denied having any inclinations towards Bruno, while clarifying why she had asked. "Oh heavens no, the man is practically old enough to be my father. I was merely surprised at how well he has aged, considering what I have heard regarding the rapid aging men go through while at war. Aging was highly correlated with stress. The more stressed one was, the faster they aged. Typically, that is. Some people were just genetically gifted to age well, regardless. Bruno was of such a variety. In fact, his entire family line was. But such knowledge wouldn't become proven for many decades to come. And as a result, the Tsar was quick to nod his head in agreement with his daughter's statement. Indeed, the man seems to be keeping the specter of time away somehow. Or perhaps war is simply his place in this world, and has no effect on him as a result. It would most certainly explain why he is such a visionary in the field. This, of course, prompted the princess's next question, one that her royal father was not the least expecting. Speaking of, "Father, are we going to field tanks of our own? I have heard that the Allies are now building them by the thousands. So then why must the Germans be the only ones to produce their panzers? Is our empire so behind that we lack the industry to do so?" Considering it was his youngest daughter posing this question to him, and not his only son, the Russian Tsar was rather perplexed why she seemed to care so much about military matters, or politics in general, and was naturally quick to inquire about the origin of her knowledge. "And who exactly has been telling you about the ongoings of the war? How do you even know what tanks are?" Naturally, this information had come from Olga, who had remarkably loose lips when it came to what she and her little cabal of imperial princesses discussed over the phone regarding the war effort and Bruno's role in it. Curiously enough, Anastasia's eldest sister was quick to the rescue as she confirmed it had been her to speak of the matters. "I assure you, Father, this is entirely my fault. I was discussing the matter with the Archduchess Hedwig and the Princess Victoria Louise. We have a vested interest in the war after all, and have been discussing what we have been able to learn to regard its current state." The Grand Duchess looked almost guilty as she said this, and Nicholas narrowed his gaze at her, sighing heavily as he shook his head, not wanting to get into a discussion about his eldest daughter still having some inclination towards Bruno and his well-being. Instead, he shifted the subject towards answering what Anastasia had asked him. "It's only a prototype design, but yes, we have learned quite a bit regarding tanks and how they function as a result of studying the German panzers in the field. And we do believe that we have something that, while maybe not as effective as the German designs, will most certainly be able to help our allies push through the Italian ranks in the Alps. By the summer, we hope to field an armored battalion in full support of the German advance. Would you like to see our current design?" The two young Grand Duchesses were shocked that their father, the Tsar of the Russian Empire, had even bothered asking if they wanted to see the current prototype. But they were both quick to agree without any hesitation on their part. Lead the way. Chapter 333. Introduction of Russian Armor Part 2. Two of the Russian Tsar's daughters had accepted his offer to take a look at the Russian Army's newest prototype. It was a domestically manufactured tank design based upon observations made in the field. Like everyone else, there were many things being copied from the German design that were very forward-thinking, obviously within their own manufacturing capabilities. And eavesdropping on this conversation had been the Tsar's only son, who was equally as interested in the venture. Because of this, the Tsar and three of his children took an armored motorcade to the factory where the prototype was currently laying dormant. The three children, the oldest of which was actually now an adult, gazed in awe at what they saw. The Russian tank prototype was a far better design than the Allied Mk2. For starters, there were plenty of Russian engineers in the field deployed alongside German soldiers. They were given a far greater capacity to observe the German tanks and how they functioned. Copying a torsion bar suspension was actually quite easy, as it was ironically enough the most easy to produce of all the major tank suspension types, and oddly enough, had not really begun to see service until the latter half of the Second World War. Ease of manufacture, and requiring far less rare earth metals to manufacture it was ideal for the Russian industry, which was lacking compared to that of the German Reich. In addition to this, the armored hull was sloped and welded, which was a vast improvement over the Allied Mk2, which had a semi-sloped design and was made of thin riveted steel plates. While not as advanced as the rolled homogeneous armor in use by the Germans, it was most certainly a tank capable of sustaining fire and dealing deadly blows. Lessons also learned by the Germans was the introduction of a rotating turret. Due to the commonality of ammunition being mandatory, Russian and Austro-Hungarian arms developed resembled that used by the Germans in many ways. As such, the main gun on the turret was a 5 cm gun that largely resembled the Soviet 45 mm anti-tank gun in 1932 from Bruno's past life. In fact, the overall design and shape of this new light tank resembled the Soviet T-50 light tank in many ways. And when the Tsar's children laid eyes on it, they were astonished. The first domestically produced tank was a major sign of Russia's increased prestige on the global stage. Currently, only 3 nations had managed to field a tank. The Germans had both the most advanced tank in the field and the highest number of them, while the French and British had combined their resources to field their own domestically produced armored vehicles. Tanks were the modern symbol of a major power. Such weapons changed with the era. Just 10 years prior, dreadnought battleships were such an icon. But as times had swiftly changed, and the nature of warfare with it, the world began to realize if you did not have tanks, or at least the ability to defeat them, then you might as well just yield to whatever demands were imposed on you by the enemy when they came knocking. Without a doubt, the Russian T-16, as they were calling it, was a vast improvement over the Allied Mk2, and while not quite as grand as the Panzer I Bruno was currently fielding, it would be able to provide extensive support to the Russian infantry, and hopefully prove Russia was not holding the Germans back in this war. After all, the Tsar wanted to prove to Bruno that Russia was more than capable of being his home, if he so chose to do so. And thus he was quite confident as he spoke of the device and the plans to mass produce it. We won't be able to produce as many as the Germans have fielded thus far, nor is it as grand as a vehicle. I'm not sure entirely how they manage it, but I have no doubt their armor is of a better quality than ours. Even so, I would bet a fortune on one of these being able to take out 2 Allied tanks before it is obliterated. Luckily for us, our production rate should be able to keep up with such demands. What do you all think? Have our engineers done a good job producing a tank? It was not like the children of the Tsar knew anything about tank design or warfare. But even so, gazing upon the armored vehicle, they couldn't help but admire its production. This meant that Russia was starting to overcome its status as a backwater in Europe, and perhaps might very well contend with the greatest of the world's powers in due time. Thus, Olga was the first to speak as she confirmed her thoughts on the tank to her father. I must admit, I may not know much about the subject, but even I can tell such a thing will be a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Our troops will be glad to know they have armor supporting their advance, and I am sure it will be an enormous boost to morale. Congratulations, father. Boosting morale wasn't exactly necessary for the Central Powers. They had won all the major battles of the war so far, and had already taken half of the initial Allied powers out of the war. The men who were in the Russian army were actually eager to march on Rome and force the Italians to kneel before the crown. As for Nicholas, he was just happy that the tank he had designed seemed formidable in the eyes of his children. He had learned much of rulership over the past 10 years to compensate for his inadequate upbringing, and now he could finally consider himself among the world's foremost, most powerful men. Or so he hoped. This was what Russia's new tank meant. Either way, its performance had yet to be determined. But the Tsar was hopeful, and so were his children. And that was all that mattered to the House of Romanov for the time being. Chapter 334. The Butterfly Effect Strikes Again. While the German home front was far more stable than in Bruno's past life, largely because of the fact that their losses had been minimal when compared to what had occurred in the previous timeline, France and Britain were far from okay. Millions lie dead on both of their ends. And the current offensive was adding to those numbers by the tens of thousands with each passing day. The number of deaths between the two nations was rapidly approaching 3 million, and that would be more than had occurred during the same conflict as it had previously occurred. The governments tried to hide this reality from the people, but it was not an easy task. Sure, they could lie about those who had died in the field to their families, to prevent them from spreading the news as more and more loved ones failed to return from the front. But how did they explain it when the scheduled leave of the soldier came, and yet they did not return home? Can you imagine the shit show it would cause if the government lied about your son or brother dying in war, only for it to be revealed when the time came for him to temporarily come home and get some rest? That was a possibility that fortunately the Allied powers were at least intelligent enough to understand would single-handedly cause the downfall of the war. Thus, they tried their best to suppress the actual death statistics by tightly controlling the media. But of course word of mouth spread like wildfire. If everyone you knew lost a son, brother, uncle, or cousin in the war, it did not take a hyper-intelligent mind to begin putting the numbers together in their head. I mean, what were the odds that all the casualties occurring in the war came from the same small town somewhere in the middle of Wales? And thus was the problem. One could not fully conceal this matter with such overwhelming death rates. And the worst of it all were the millions more wounded in action who returned home bearing stories of their time in the trenches. Of course, There were also prisoners of war to account for which the Germans captured and treated humanely. At first, the Allies tried to blame many of these deaths on the Germans mistreating their prisoners of war. But this was quickly countered by news team from France, Britain, the United States, and any other nation that was interested being allowed into the prisons where these POWs rested. The treatment was well above and beyond what the Hague Conventions required, and was a way for the Germans to avoid these accusations entirely. And since a large amount of the press within America was within Bruno's sphere of influence, they would naturally mass print the stories of German proper treatment of prisoners of war, as well as openly criticize the British and French governments for slandering the German Reich with such baseless accusations. To put it simply, as more men did not return from the front, Britain and France began to feel this sting deeply. Factories remained understaffed, forcing women into the workplace, while farms were starting to become affected as well. In fact, crop outputs this year were a lot less than they had been in the past. The war was taking its toll on Britain and France alike, and the more the government tried to crack down on this, the more rebellious the people most affected became. As the German High Command decided to arm these rebels, they were now using weapons that were more than capable of inflicting casualties on the British Home Guard and France's army from behind the scenes. The objective was simple. The war needed to come to an end. Not a year from now, not a month from now. It needed to end today. And because of this, masked men wearing otherwise normal civilian clothes parked a car nearby the building which housed the British Parliament and climbed into a nearby tower before opening their suitcases, which revealed several scoped rifles, which were the sanitized Mauser 98s the Germans had given them, along with an older piece of optical glass that was of obscure origin attached to its receiver in a job that looked like it had been done in someone's garage. As one of the men took up aim within the window and gazed down the sight of his weapon, he was quick to comment through his red scarf about their objective. "Do you really think if we kill this fucker then they will blame it on the Reds?" The other man looked at the guy who had said this as if he was an idiot before blatantly giving voice to such sentiment. "Are you a fucking mongoloid? Of course they will. Do we? Or do we not look like Reds right now? We just need to shoot this fucker and then fire off a bunch of shots, bringing attention to ourselves. Afterwards, they will focus their attention on those Bolshevik fucks instead of us." The man who was so thoroughly insulted to his face was about to argue when his target appeared walking out of the parliamentary building's main doors. If someone from Bruno's past life, with a modicum of knowledge of world history, were to gaze upon the man's appearance, they would recognize instantly that he was none other than Winston Churchill, a man who was currently serving as the First Lord of the British Admiralty, the foremost civilian advisor to the British Navy. He had just given a speech to Parliament about how Britannia would once more be ruling the waves before long. And now he was about to step into his car and return to safety. Or so was the plan. Unfortunately for him, a team of snipers had their sights set on his chest and head. And after the count of 3, they all squeezed their triggers, sending their rounds down range and hitting the legendary British Prime Minister 3 times. Twice to the chest and once to the head. After which, the men dressed up as communist revolutionaries fled the scene, making a ton of noise and yelling several Marxist chants as they did so. Without Bruno directly intervening, the man who had been responsible for the British stubbornly refusing to accept a white peace in 1940 after Dunkirk, as well as the man who was at fault for the end of the British Empire, and Great Britain's place in the world as a major power, had been slain in the streets in the spring of 1916. Thoroughly sparking British condemnation of socialists, communists, and all other brands of Marxists that may rear their ugly faces in otherwise polite society. In doing so, the course of history had forever been changed, and it was unknown whether or not it was within the favor of Bruno or against him. Chapter 335. Major implications on the timeline. The untimely demise of Winston Churchill would affect the entire world, and in ways that were completely unpredictable. Even with his knowledge of future events, and a much higher ability to see patterns and predict their outcomes well in advance, Bruno could not accurately pin down what exactly would result as a result of the would-be future British Prime Minister's assassination. Granted, his own actions had directly changed the course of history much in the same vein, but this was completely unexpected, and when Bruno heard the news, well, it was easy to understand why he was shocked, that is, if you understood his perspective, which nobody besides his wife truly did. In fact, Heidi herself could easily surmise that this was not something that was supposed to happen as it flooded the news. She might not be an unmatched genius, nor had she been college-educated, but she had grown up in Bruno's family library along with him and had received a proper education herself up until the age of marriage. She was more than capable of understanding the reality that this was something which was not supposed to happen. Even if Bruno had not mentioned once or twice Churchill's name in the context of future events that had yet to transpire in this life, something Heidi was immediately able to conjure from memory, she would have known that this was an event that was not supposed to have occurred. She wanted desperately to try to get a hold of her husband to figure out what was going on, but the man was obviously quite busy with the war in Italy, and it would be difficult even with her resources to take him away from that. All she could do as she listened to the radio broadcast depicting the assassination in the most gruesome light was a hope that Bruno would have a way to adapt, improvise, and overcome the challenges this would no doubt force him to undergo as the war continued to wage on. The German High Command was rather shocked to learn that Churchill had been slain in the streets of London. The weapon used was said to have been chambered in .303 British and had supposedly from the ballistic science fired out of a 640mm barrel, which meant it very well could have been a Lee Enfield SMLE, which was currently seeing service in the field. Or it could have been one of the sanitized Mauser 98s that was rechambered, rebarreled, and given a new stock as well as scrubbed of all manufacturer markings and proof marks to conceal where it had come from. If this was the case, then the German Reich would, in some part, be held responsible for the death of Churchill. But there was really no way to tell as the assassins had escaped, and they were said to have been wearing red masks and armbands, symbolizing them as a member of the British Union of Socialists, a radical Bolshevik organization inspired by the Red Army that had emerged in Great Britain as a result of Bruno's interference in the timeline. And if that were the case, then the Germans were in the clear, as they would never arm Marxist revolutionaries after seeing what they did to Russia a decade prior. The reality was that the communists ended up taking the blame, despite the men who conducted the attack being a patriotic yet isolationist group which wanted an end to the war. Churchill, being among the most hawkish of the British government, needed to die for them to get what they wanted. As there was no possibility of peace between Germany and Britain that did not first result in Germany being wholly crushed in the process so long as Churchill drew breath. And since this was proving to be an outright impossibility to achieve, the war would continue until the Germans finally decided to stop farming their men for XP and march on Paris. Having leadership that understood this reality very well, these British patriots marked Churchill for death and framed the British Union of Socialists for the hit. And for the first time since the war began, the British government began having an argument with themselves over whether or not continuing the fight was really worth the effort. The losses sustained thus far for the British were quickly closing in on 1 million men in Europe alone. Then there were the deaths in colonies and the multiple rebellions they were currently having to put down across the world. Not to mention the damage inflicted on the Royal Navy, which would require a decade at least to fully recover from. This was a war which was going on far longer than they initially expected it to, and the home front was on the brink of completely breaking out into civil war, especially now that the First Lord of the Admiralty was slain outside of Parliament by revolutionary socialists. But if they yielded now, the Germans would easily become the supreme power of Europe and possibly the entire world. If they were not already, that is. British influence would no doubt wane, and their allies would be left to be trampled over. Was this a price the British government was truly willing to pay for peace? That was the debate currently taking place within the House of Commons and Lords, while King George V sat on his throne, debating what in the hell he was supposed to do with this mess. He had damn near gone into total shock after hearing that Churchill of all people was assassinated. As his ministers, many of which were on opposing sides of the issue, tried to counsel him, George realized that the ultimate factor in deciding whether or not they remained in the war was actually located on the other side of the Atlantic, and because of this he was quick to ask what the opinion of the United States was on recent developments. And how exactly are the American elections going? Is the pro-intervention candidate winning or losing? At first nobody said a word, until finally, after several moments of silently looking at one another, one of the king's minister finally informed him of how the American elections were proceeding. It would appear that the Democrats' most likely nominee will be Woodrow Wilson. After spending the last 4 years dispelling his slandered reputation and the rumors surrounding him, he is gaining popularity by promising to reopen the economy to the world and intervening in the conflict by selling weapons, munitions, and other manufactured goods. I would say, as it currently stands, there is no way of knowing who will win the general election. After hearing this, King George sighed heavily and remained utterly silent. There were too many thoughts on his mind, and no answers to give for the time being. Either way, what Britain chose to do now would have major implications of the future of not only their empire, but the entire world. Chapter 336, Reclaiming Trient. The Italians were dug within their fortifications, having fallen back past their initial gains at the border of Trient. The territory was large and vast in size, or at least relatively so with the resources currently at their disposal. Perhaps in anticipation that the Germans, Russi, and Austro-Hungarians would be descending upon them like a tidal wave of steel, they wisely adopted the policy of abandoning all the territory they had seized during the winter offensive of 1914, and instead consolidate their position in an area that was more advantageous for defensive warfare. The Allies had to admit, without the winter to cover their advance, and the carelessness of the Austro-Hungarian army on Christmas Day of 1914, they would have never broken through the fortifications the Central Powers had built in the region. To put it simply, they were hoping these defenses would allow them to halt the German advance in Italy, sacrificing a pawn to protect the king, so to speak. There was just one problem with this mentality. Bruno's companies had overseen the construction projects that build these massive border fortifications. Not that the Italians were aware of this fact, and thus while they stood on watch, gazing over the sandbags and barbed wire which sat atop the steel-reinforced concrete trenches, one of the men could not help but remark on how quiet things were. Normally by now the Germans would have attacked, no? So why is it that I hear no engines in the distance? Are we really just supposed to sit here and wait for their attack? It is not like the man's comrade did not understand this sentiment, as he was quick to respond with his own remarks regarding the issue. Man, I'm the same fucking rank as you. Do you honestly believe they tell me shit like that? Obviously, whatever the generals have planned it is way above our pay grade. I swear to God you're always. The man suddenly stopped as he stared in horror at his friend. A German soldier with a Stahl helm that was painted with camouflage and a Totenkopf that was decorated over it stood with his gas grenade in one gloved hand and a gas mask on his face. Before the Italian soldier who had spotted him could even say anything, the German stormtrooper pulled the pin and tossed the device near their feet, before disappearing into the shadows as if he were some kind of spectral entity. The gas spread rapidly, too rapidly, and began to suffocate the Italian soldiers within the trench complex, who struggled to hang on for dear life as they began to cough. But it was too late. Phosgene gas had begun through the air and affected everybody inside. Bruno stood on a mountain above the bunker complex he had helped build on the Alpine border between Austria and Italy. In preparation for chemical warfare, it had been fitted with its own ventilation system. But he had sent men in to disarm these systems, so that they could gas out the complex while most men slept. By now, the soldiers of Bruno's army, or at least the most battle-hardened and elite, were quite skilled at infiltration and sabotage. It was an effortless thing for them to do. And as the Italians woke to a cloud of phosgene above their heads, the German soldiers began to rush into the trench complex. Covered from head to toe in thick wool clothing, gas masks, and leather gloves and boots that were tied off with puttees, the Germans ran into the phosgene with bayonets attached and fearless expressions on their faces, silently stabbing those Allied soldiers within the border defenses to death in a swift and lethal attack. While other areas of the border defense were facing a frontal assault by the Austro-Hungarians and Russians, here in the most critical area, Bruno made sure to eliminate his enemy in a well-executed assault. And sure enough, the strip of border he assaulted fell to the German army within the hour. All of the Allies having either choked to death on the liquid pooling up in their lungs, or having been stabbed by German steel. Either way, casualties were almost non-existent on the German part. Those who managed to muster some form of a defense of their own life while afflicted with poison gas did not manage much in terms of retaliation before being sent to meet their maker. And when the flag of the Austro-Hungarian Empire raised over the bunker complex again, Bruno got on the radio and confirmed that the most well-fortified portion had been secured, and that his men would now spread through the complex to assault the Allies from their flanks, while Germany's allies continued to press forward from the front. With Trient reclaimed, and Italy's defenses on the border of Tyrol thoroughly dismantled overnight, the path to Rome had been opened, and the Allies would be forced to reconsolidate their forces, with those who survived and retreated having been forced to draw a new line of defense and battle plan after realizing the Germans were getting a bit too good at countering them. In fact, the idea of waging a defensive war in Italy was starting to seem like a bad idea, as every time they tried, the Germans found some new way to easily overcome their fortifications. Italy now wondering whether or not continuing this war was a good idea. After all, they had joined because of the fact that the Central Powers snubbed them multiple times in the previous decade, and thought this would be a good way to gain some disputed territories with Austro-Hungary. But with the current projection of the war, and when they considered the fact that they had not lost nearly as much as Great Britain and France had during the course of the war, and thus were not suffering from the sunk cost fallacy like their allies were, it made them deeply consider the possibility of suing for peace. However, would the powers that be which wanted a German defeat allow for such a thing? Not without a fight. That's for damn sure. Chapter 337, Warhounds. It was not long before the Allies were once more forced to flee from their position. They had made a critical error in assuming the Central Powers did not know exactly when, where, and how to hit the critical areas of defense. Bruno had of course built the border complex to be damn near impenetrable from weapons of the era. There was just one thing the Allies weren't expecting. He also designed them to have secret passageways that could be utilized by his own forces should they ever be forced to abandon the complex. A properly staffed, manned and supplied fortress would have remained unbroken for a decade, if not more. There was just one problem, a problem Germany had been plagued with in both timelines, and that was the incompetence of its allies. The Austro-Hungarians had underestimated the desperation and willingness of their enemies, leaving watch posts designed to keep a constant vigil of the surroundings with intersecting lines of fire and zero blind spots completely unguarded during the dead of winter. This allied the Italians to breach the fortress and slay its inhabitants, gaining it for their own possession and holding it for over a year. Bruno was a man who prepared for every possibility he could conceive, and understanding that his allies would likely fail him if he was not in direct control over their actions. He had of course made sure there were measures in place to easily regain control over the fortress should the need arise. This was how Bruno's stormtroopers had infiltrated the complex, shut down its ventilation systems, and gassed out its inhabitants without leaving the slightest trace of their intentions before it was too late. Now, after the phosgene had been carefully purged from every crevice of the facility, Bruno stepped foot within it, taking off his gas mask as he brazenly gazed around. Heinrich was by his side, along with several other officers. Heinrich's Jaegers had been instrumental in the assault on the facility, as they had provided the reconnaissance necessary to determine the best time for the attack. And he was naturally in the different uniform than the others around him. While the 8th Army still continued to wear the standard M15 pattern uniforms, with minor alterations such as individual soldiers' hand painting their helmets to include camouflage patterns and Totenkopfs, as well as the unit insignia on their left biceps. The Jaegers had been given specialty uniforms, of the same pattern, but in full splitter tarnmuster. This meant that the helmets had a splinter camo cover, the field blouses were in the same pattern, as were the trousers. These men also wore camouflage face paint, as well as made use of specialty canvas load-bearing equipment in a Feldgrau pattern. Their boots were a brown leather, with Feldgrau puttees, and they painted their weapons in a color pattern that was reminiscent of those used by the Rhodesian security forces in Bruno's past life. These Jaegers had been the spearhead of Bruno's operations. Once deployed behind enemy lines, their objective was to gather intelligence on enemy positions and coordinate information between aerial, artillery, and ground assets, as well as call in strikes on the objective. They were damn good at their jobs, and they favored the G-43 over the Fedorov Avtomat, as automatic rifle fire was less useful for their missions than a properly scoped semi-automatic rifle. If they had found themselves engaging enough hostile forces where the need for that kind of firepower was necessary, then a multitude of things had already gone wrong leading up to that point. Heinrich was quick to comment on the situation as he gazed upon the deceased Allied soldiers whose corpses were currently being dragged out of the fortress by the German Eighth Army. I'm not going to lie. This seems like the kind of thing that Eric would love. Where the hell has that bastard been, anyway? I haven't seen him since. Well, I honestly can't remember now that I think about it. Bruno was quick to dismiss these concerns as he reached into his coat pocket, instinctively looking for his flask of alcohol, only to remember that he had quit drinking outside of having a liter of beer with his dinner during times of peace. After he began to grip his own fist together tightly, forcing himself to remember that he was no longer about these habits, he redirected the conversation elsewhere. He's around. Tell me, Heinrich, how many men did we lose in the assault? Heinrich looked over and yelled at one of the medics who was currently tending to a German soldier who appeared to have suffered from chemical burns, having clearly not properly taped off his sleeves to prevent the chemical gas from touching his skin. Hey, Corporal, how many did we lose? The medic looked surprised at first, before repeating a number that Bruno was actually surprised to hear. Lose? As in dead? None so far. We have a few who were injured by ricochets or stab wounds. But with all due respect, sir, if you don't let me get back to my job, we might very well have a death on our hands. Heinrich nodded his head, confirming that the man was free to continue with what he was doing, as he checked to see if the injured soldier's lungs were affected by the phosgene gas or not. As for Bruno, he was quick to comment on how much he valued such a victory. It's not every day we gain a major victory with 0 Kia and only a few dozen wounded. I would celebrate if we had the time to do so. Unfortunately, the enemy won't wait for us to make thanks to the Lord for his protection. So all we can do is continue forward. Once our allies have resupplied and taken care of their wounded, we will push further south. I want Rome to capitulate by the end of summer at the latest. Had any other commander made such an audacious claim, Heinrich would be more than willing to chew him out for it. It was unreasonable to expect an entire theater of war to end within a single year, let alone half of one. But Bruno had made the impossible possible over and over again, and he had proven his willingness to get home safely to his wife and children as soon as he possibly could, no matter what that may feasibly cost. If anyone could pull such a monumental victory off, it would be him. Thus, Heinrich was quick to respond in the affirmative. I'll relay your orders. The Italian king stood before his generals who informed them of their latest defeat. In the span of a fortnight, Trient had been recaptured by the Central Powers, and the enemy was now marching freely into Italian territory. Venice had already begun to send reinforcements to the broken forces who had fled their defeat. But there was only so much they could do. The Allies had time and again proven incapable of dealing with the Germans. Previously, King Victor Emmanuel III had joined the Allies because he felt slighted by his previous allies on several occasions. And it was a good opportunity to press for disputed lands with Austro-Hungary. But now, victory was almost impossible. The Allies were throwing everything they had at the Germans and were failing miserably doing so. There was simply no other way to say it. Germany had too great of an advantage, whether it be strategic, tactical, logistical, or simply technological. The German army had presented a masterclass in preparing for the wars of the new era. It should have been apparent that from the moment they began mass-producing machine guns at the start of the century that they had an understanding far greater than anyone else on how war should be waged. When the war began, Germany had more machine guns, modern artillery, pilots, aircraft, more tanks, armored cars, and submarines than the rest of the world combined. In addition to this, the grand strategy they practiced had proven most effective. To put it simply, the Germans had prepared for this war in the best way they possibly could, and the results were as clear as day. Now the German Eighth Army was breathing down the Italian king's neck, and they were perhaps the most fearsome force of warfighters the world had ever seen up until this point. An army of battle-hardened veterans, each of which had been hand-selected to join based upon their aptitude, experience, and merit. The lowest-ranking members of the unit had 2 years of practical combat experience and had been the top of their class in basic training and their specialty schools. Meanwhile, they were led by veterans of the Iron Division who had obliterated the Red Army without mercy during the Russian Civil War a decade prior. To put it simply, the Kaiser had unleashed his hounds upon Italy, and now the King of Italy had to figure out how to react. Because of this, he sighed heavily before speaking the words that Bruno had come to expect of the Italians after their performance in both world wars of his past life. Is it too late to switch sides? Chapter 338. Insubordination. Germany had set an example, which the world at large was now trying desperately to catch up to. And while Russia had led the charge in creating a more modern and functional tank prototype to compete against the Allied powers and their Mk2, as well as the German Panzer I, it was ultimately the Austro-Hungarians who had produced something rather exceptional, one that Bruno had not anticipated when the war broke out. In his past life, Austro-Hungary was a major power, but one that had more or less completely and utterly failed to collectively get its shit together. This was much in the same vein as the Russians. Whether it was the nonsense the existence of the dual monarchy caused related to logistical and military affairs, or simply being cursed with some of the worst generals of the war, Austro-Hungary had been a major blight on Germany's chances to win the war, as the German army had to more or less carry them to the finish line. But this was not the case in this life. Bruno's initial contact with the Habsburgs, and having been bold enough to point out the major flaws which their military faced, caused 10 years of reforms across the entire nation. Whether political, legal, economic, or military matters, Austro-Hungary had worked hard to prove itself as a real power in this world. Bruno had largely been oblivious to these facts due to his own supremacy on the global stage as well as his bias towards the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But today he would be proved wrong, as he stood in complete and utter astonishment at Austro-Hungary's first tank company, which they had managed to sneak into the Alps without his notice. The tanks in question were very similar in design to the Hungarian prototype 44M TAZ tank, which, despite being developed by a minor power during Bruno's past life, as unironically one of the best designs of the war. A pity it was never fielded in that life. But in this life, something one might say a miniature version was rolling past Bruno, as the man near dropped his jaw in disbelief at what he was witnessing. The hull was similar in overall dimensions to his Panzer I, and the turret was clearly making use of a 5 cm main gun, much like the one on Bruno's Panzers. But the shape of both the turret and its hull, along with the positions of the tracks, wheels, etc., most definitely was reminiscent of the 44M TAZ Hungarian medium tank that in Bruno's past life was meant to be the German Panther's equal. Hell, if this thing was made of rolled homogeneous armor instead of what was clearly welded plates of a similar thickness as his own armor, it would easily be an equal to the tanks he was fielding in this life. When Bruno saw the Austro-Hungarian flags waving off the backs of this armored company, he had to admit that while the Austrians may have been Germans best known for their cultural achievements rather than their scientific and industrial feats, at the end of the day, if they put their mind to it, they were still Germans. So much so that when Bruno finally came across the Austro-Hungarian general who was sent to assist him in the Alps, he had to inquire about them. I'm not going to lie to you. I did not expect a tank of such caliber to be fielded by your empire. Your engineers must have been working overtime to produce such a thing. 2 years and some change, plus a hell of an expense, I'm sure. The Austro-Hungarian general was surprised to receive such praise from Bruno regarding his empire's newest tank design. Bruno was a man who was generally seen by his allies as cold, ruthless, and unfriendly. For him to go out of his way to approach an allied general and praise the work of Austrian engineers, the tank must be far more impressive than the Austro-Hungarian general thought. And he was quick to give voice to such sentiment. Do you really believe they are that good? I mean, sure, we definitely took inspiration from the tanks you have been fielding, but we were not able to create a precise replica. Bruno was quick to confirm that at least by outward appearance the tanks looked decent. He would need to look at the powertrain and some other mechanical features to be sure. But from an outward appearance, it would appear that the biggest change other than the overall size of the tank and its main gun over the prototype from his past life was the suspension had been improved to a torsion bar system like the one used on his current Panzers. I would definitely need to get a look at some of the hidden features to say for sure, but simply judging by the type of armor used, the shape of the hull and turret, as well as the wheel placement and suspension system, this looks like it will be a very useful tank for the remaining duration of the war. Now, if only we can rely on the Russians to field a tank half as grand as this one, I do believe even if we fought an entire world full of enemies here in Europe, our alliance would still emerge victorious. Bruno did not realize it, but the Russians were indeed working on their own domestic tank design. However, it was far from approved for service, let alone being manufactured en masse. It was still in the prototype stage, and after witnessing the Austro-Hungarian tank being introduced to the field and how it performed, the Russians would probably go back to the drawing board and improve their own design in several small ways. But that was a matter of concern for another time. With the Austro-Hungarian and Russian allies having coalesced together, the time to invade Italy had begun. Thus, Bruno was quick to send out his orders as he jumped into the back of a command half-track, which began to depart with the rest of the army at the given time. Italy's king and its leaders were very worried about the army that was advancing down the Alps and towards their capital. On the one hand, their allies had fought and bled by their side to defend Italy from the Central Powers and their advance. However, on the other hand, Italy was about to be completely and utterly steamrolled by a numerical and technologically superior enemy. He could either raise the white flag and surrender now, or try to betray his allies and join the other side. Either way, King Victor Emmanuel III was quick to reach out to the German Kaiser and attempt to stall his warhound's advance with potential peace negotiations. Negotiations that were surprisingly accepted by the Kaiser, as he agreed to meet with the Italian king in Geneva to discuss the matters in person. Bruno and his army had already started their advance down the Tyrolean Alps and towards the city of Milan when he received word over the wire that he would need to halt his advance and freeze the front lines until a peace agreement could be made. The message was communicated to him by the radio operator within his command half-track, which Bruno was quick to motion to the man to take off his headset and mute his microphone. Bruno then gave his response to the man in the most bone-chilling tone he could. "I'm sorry, what were the Kaiser's orders? I don't believe I heard them clearly. It would appear due to the elevation, we are having trouble establishing stable lines of communication. Tell him to repeat his orders for me." As the radio operator relayed Bruno's orders while perfectly understanding what his superior officer was doing, Bruno shut off the radio entirely, making it appear like they had utterly lost contact with Berlin. After doing so, Bruno gave another order to the radio operator in his vehicle. "Relay orders to the rest of the unit. The Austro-Hungarian army will diverge and assault the city of Venice, along with their forces currently stationed in Trieste, while the Russians will split off from the main group and capture Turin. As for the 8th Army, they will continue their advance to Milan without a single moment's rest." The radio operator was quick to relay Bruno's orders to the necessary figures. After doing so, he was quick to ask his commanding officer the immediate question on his mind. "Sir, aren't we disobeying orders directly from the Kaiser by doing this?" Bruno raised his brow, again reiterating what he had said previously, this time with a far more hostile tone in his voice. "What orders? Our communications went out before we could clarify what High Command had told us. We are simply doing our jobs and seizing control over the nearest major strategic objectives. And if, for whatever reason, the Italian king has decided to see reason and pursue peace, the Reich will now be in a far greater position of strength to enforce the demands of the Central Powers when they do so." Knowing better than to speak against Bruno's insubordination any further, the radio operator was quick to acknowledge that he had indeed not heard anything over the wire, because they were truly suffering from communication issues as a result of the elevation and the difficulty that radio waves had traveling through mountains. And he would maintain that story and never once divert from it until he died of natural causes many decades later. Chapter 339, A Risky Gamble. Radio communications were still a new technology, one that was relatively untested on the battlefield, and they were also a form of communication that was notorious for having spotty connectivity when within mountainous regions. Hence why most military units also typically carried a satellite phone and at least one other form of communication during Bruno's past life. Thus, it was understandable as they were rolling through the mountains that communications that were designed to be relayed between the front lines of the Alpine Theater and Berlin would suddenly go dark at a critical moment of peace negotiations. Or, at the very least, it was plausible enough that Bruno had an excuse for outright disobedience and insubordination, two things that in this day and age would get you the firing squad if severe enough. Why had Bruno feigned these communication issues and disobeyed his direct orders, which came from the top of the German military and the Kaiser himself? Because as it stood, Italy was negotiating from a rather strong position. Sure, the borders had returned to their pre-war state, and they had lost hundreds of thousands of men in the conflict so far. But they could pull the card that with this becoming the primary theater, help was on the way from their allies in Britain and France. They had not lost enough that the Central Powers were in an overwhelmingly dominant position to press their own desires from. However, if the war came to a stop after Bruno had seized Milan, Turin, Venice, and Genoa for major cities in their surrounding regions in northern Italy, as well as two of Italy's most prominent ports, well, now Austro-Hungary and the German Reich would be in a position to make damn near any demands they desired. As such, the Germans rapidly advanced to Milan, which was the closest of their objectives, while the Russian and Austro-Hungarians within the theater deployed to the areas in which Bruno had ordered them to go. To say that the German army was swift was an understatement. With the power train on board their tanks and their relative lightweight, they were more than capable of maintaining speeds that were beyond that of more modern and larger armored vehicles. Meanwhile, the distance between the borders of Trient and Milan was not all that far. As a result, it was only a few hours before the German Eighth Army arrived in the vicinity of the Italian city, which had existed since it was once called Medhelenon by the Celts who founded it in the 6th century BC. By now, the people were aware of who was marching into their city the moment the army of tanks and mechanized infantry rolled up on their doorstep. But whether or not they would mount a resistance or surrender without a fight had yet to be determined. As the monarch of the German Empire, power to initiate and engage in diplomacy fell within the Kaiser's power according to the Constitution. As a result, he found himself in Geneva to discuss the potential surrender of the Italian army. In addition to Wilhelm II, Franz Joseph had also arrived. Despite being 86 years old, the man was as spry as a spring chicken. One might even say that he was not remotely looking like death was keeping an eye on him. And why would he be? Bruno's investment into medicine's greatest minds had produced many miracle drugs before they were ever meant to hit the market. One of these was the invention of antibiotic. Penicillin had hit the shelves just in time for the war and was used widely across the German Reich, Austro-Hungary, and the Russian Empire. It had saved so many soldiers' lives within the Central Powers that the entire team responsible for its creation was being heavily awarded by the various states where it was widely distributed. Franz Joseph was supposed to die in November of pneumonia. But with the introduction of penicillin and other antibiotics being developed, the cure had been made for this disease that had been lethal throughout all of human history. By the year 2025, the treatment for pneumonia was so common that some people were even so foolish as to even engage in activities that were counter to the healing process, such as drinking heavily, smoking heavily, and of course training at a gym while trying not to cough up a lung because they were still suffering from pneumonia. Idiotic as that maybe it was a disease that few people took as seriously as they probably should. But here in 1914, it was still a lethal disease. Or it should have been all the way until 1928 when penicillin was supposed to be discovered. Thus far, Bruno had done little save the lives of historical figures who were of great importance. He did not have the means to extend Meiji's lifespan, and his desire for intervening in Russia had more to do with his hatred of the Bolsheviks than it did saving the Romanovs from their gruesome and unjust fate. Hell, he had already calculated the death of Franz Joseph's plans, forgetting entirely the cause of the man's death that was now easily fixed. In fact, it was likely that the Austrian emperor would live to see the end of the war, unless, of course, he befell some other fatal ailment. Of course, it was not like the man knew he was quite literally a few months away from what should have been his expiration date, and because of this he was in quite a good mood, as he sat in front of the Italian king, who was practically groveling before the two mighty emperors. Italy was the least of the great powers, and that had been proven in this war. Now Italy wanted to pull out before her homeland could be lit ablaze by the natural consequences which had followed her king's choices. Of course, the Italian king was in poor shape as he proceeded to initiate the negotiation, believing in error that he still had some leverage to pull in his favor. So tell me, what is required on my end to get you to call off your damned hounds? Chapter 340, Capitulation. Call off his hounds. Surely he was not referring to Bruno, was he? That was a bit of an insult, now wasn't it? Either way, the Kaiser thought little of the remarks made by the Italian king as he spoke of his demands to end the war, which were not the same as Franz Joseph's. Frankly speaking, I'm fine with a white peace. Or at the very least, a treaty which imposes favoritism towards the German Reich and its merchants when it comes to trade between our two nations. But I am quite certain that my friend here has other plans. Ultimately, it will be between the two of you to decide how you wish to settle this matter. Franz Jospe smiled and nodded his head at Wilhelm's words. Austria, after all, shared a border with Italy, and Italy had done a number on its border towns during their occupation. Some proper recompense was in order, and the Habsburgs would not accept peace without it. And thus, after making this fact known, the two sides began debating over the amount that should be owed to the Austrian crown and its ruling dynasty over perceived damages that were caused during the time of the Italian occupation. Evidently, the Austrian emperor had a list of grievances written to him by the people that he kept on him. And because he had the receipts, so to speak, he was more adequately able to push for what he wanted, even if the balance of power was only slightly in his favor during these negotiations so far. That is until, of course, a servant came bursting into the room, whispering something to the Italian king that had him become ghostly pale, before red with rage. He stood up and immediately threw allegations at both Wilhelm and Franz Joseph, neither of which knew what their Italian counterpart was remotely talking about. You damn knaves. You seriously thought I would not find out about your dastardly schemes? The two emperors looked at each other as if they were being hoodwinked by King Victor Emmanuel III, before finally giving voice to their outright confusion. I'm sorry, but what in the hell are you talking about? We have done nothing to provoke such a furious response. This only elicited a scoff from the Italian king, who made clear what was happening in the north of Italy as of this moment. You have done nothing? Truly? Then why has Milan, Turin, Genoa, and Venice fallen into the hands of your alliance? I thought we agreed that your men would not set foot into my lands until after these negotiations had been concluded, and not a second more. So what exactly had happened if you two are not secretly conspiring behind my back? This was most certainly news to Wilhelm and Franz Joseph, and frankly speaking, they did not know if they were being set up by the Italian king in order to fall into some forced admission of wrongdoing. Because of this, they remained silent, and were just about to assure the Italian king that they truly had no idea what was happening, when their own aides came and silently whispered what they had discovered. As a result, Wilhelm sighed heavily and shook his head before repeating the lie that Bruno had stated in defense of his actions, as if it were the utmost truth. I'm afraid this is a very large misunderstanding. We sent a message over the radio to General Feldmarschall Bruno von Zehntner while he was within the Alps, but it would appear that the connection was unreliable and he did not receive the notice until after he had already marched on your territory and seized your cities. While Wilhelm may have placed his trust in Bruno, so much so that he did not fathom the idea of Bruno purposely acting against his standing orders, Franz Joseph did not believe for 1 second that this was a mere communication failure. In fact, he was quite shocked that Bruno had made such a risky gamble. Had he not been able to seize the cities so swiftly and gain the advantage on behalf of the German Reich and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he could very reasonably be facing charges of insubordination, as well as potentially sedition and treason. But his gamble had paid off, and in doing so, he had seized control over these negotiations for the Central Powers. Italy's initial position of being slightly less advantageous than Germany and Austro-Hungary now had them prostrated before the two mighty empires. There was no way to bargain about having allies sent to the ports of Venice and Genoa for reinforcements now, especially since what it sounds like, the Austro-Hungarian and Russian armies had already dealt a swift and lethal blow to the first wave of such forces. This was the death knell in the Italian king's plots to broker a suitable peace, one which favored Italy as much as possible. And once he learned that there was really no way to prove this miscommunication theory wrong, he sat back and slumped in his chair with a thoroughly defeated expression on his face. Any further resistance after this would ensure Italy's rich history burned in the flames of war, and its pristine culture was tarnished never to fully recover no matter how many generations passed. As a result, his voice was hoarse, almost as if he had been completely sucked dry of all his liquids when he officially announced his intentions to surrender. "You offer terms. I have none. Give me your worst, and I will accept them." Kaiser Wilhelm II and Franz Joseph I were bewildered by how thoroughly the Italian king lost the will to fight after Bruno's calculated gamble. It was quite a very real possibility that Italy was out of the war entirely, but the negotiations to see just how this matter concluded were far from finished. Even if the Italian king was admitting defeat, there was still much to discuss and agree upon before Italy formally capitulated to the Central Powers. Chapter 341. No price too steep. Whispers had gone quiet regarding the upcoming marriage between Erwin and Alia. After the count who challenged Christoph went missing, word quickly got around of what had happened. Everybody knew what Christoph had done, but nobody had any evidence to report him to the proper authorities. And because of this, even quietly among friends, few if any of the higher nobility dared to utter their thoughts regarding the upstart who was marrying off his son to some low-born Russian girl. Word eventually reached Heidi's ears, and because of this she invited Christoph and his wife out for tea. Gone were days where Heidi would silently dispose of people behind her husband's back. If a threat reared its ugly head, she would leave such dirty and blood business to the men in her life. Bruno was one of them, but he was about as subtle as a fragmentation grenade being tossed into a living room. But Bruno had men at his behest who were quite skilled in covert operations. Still, she had not expected Christoph to be one of them. And frankly speaking, Christoph was a man who had heard rumors of the things Heidi had done behind the scenes in the past years. There was never a shred of evidence left behind for him to confirm them, but if rumors were to be true, even to some degree, the woman had buried more men than she had saved. A saint who wielded a dagger in one hand and a syringe full of penicillin in the other. And if he was being honest, he had seldom had a reason to speak alone with Heidi in the past, nor would he want scandalous rumors to appear should people witness them together in public without their spouses. Out of both fear of potential violence, as well as the stain such baseless rumors could have on their family's reputation, Christoph brought his wife as he met with Heidi. Interestingly enough, Heidi also did not appear alone. She had her son Erwin with her. The boy was home for the summer, which had just arrived, and thus acted as his mother's companion in this exchange. Erwin, though young, had the ferocity in his sky-blue eyes that was shared with his father. But unlike his father, who was the alpha of a wolf pack who had been through scraps and scrapes with the likes of coyotes, bobcats, cougars, and bears, he was like a young pup that, while eager to prove himself, was as green as grass. Still, Christoph could not help but smile at the fortitude in his nephew's eyes as he addressed the boy first before his mother. "Erwin, you have grown much since our last encounter. I must say, you look very much like your father did when he was your age, though you have a hint of your mother's grace, which I suppose is fitting, as Bruno inherited much the same from our own mother. Unfortunately, I was never afforded such a luxury, and am a rather scruffy-looking fellow myself." Despite all of Bruno's family being relatively attractive when compared with the average population, and Christoph easily being ranked within the top 3 of his 8 other brothers, he was always the most critical of his own appearance. Erwin did not say a word in response to this. Instead, Heidi spoke. Her eyes were much softer than they had been in years past. The hint of paranoia and the ever-lurking darkness behind them were fully gone. Even her smile showed no signs of falsehood or concealed enmity. No, she had changed, and Christoph had never really been close enough to see it until now, which surprised him as the woman, who herself had been born the bastard of a prince, spoke with the civility of a woman who truly deserved her newfound status as a grand princess. "Come now, Christoph, we are family. Must we really speak with such formalities? My son is your nephew, is he not? I suppose that is why I have you to thank for shutting down those awful rumors spoken about the boy and his bride to be behind their backs." Christoph did not admit to it. After all, that would not be a wise thing to do, even if Heidi was his family by law and Erwin his nephew by blood. Admission of guilt was not something anyone should ever do, especially when it was to a crime as heinous as murder. Thus, Christoph was quick to deny the allegations. "I'm sure I know what you have heard about me, but I must state for the record that these are mere falsehoods. The Count did indeed come to my estate, but I am not responsible for whatever gruesome business he managed to get himself into after he left the grounds of my villa. Knowing the game all too well, as she had practiced it 1,000 times in the mirror herself, Heidi was quick to respond to Christoph with words that denied guilt, but a tone that assured her she knew damn well what he did, and that he need not worry about her speaking it aloud. Of course, our family is renowned for its honor and prestige. The men within our line are proud warriors, soldiers of Christ, and defenders of the crown. They are not murderers, though. I will say that the mere existence of these allegations has done wonders to stifle the words of those cowards who don't have the stones to say them in public. You should also be aware that these baseless claims against you have made you some powerful enemies. The same people who dislike my husband because of his rapid rise to power and his challenge of the status quo have now shifted their sights to you. I asked to meet with you here to warn you in advance, as these noble families are far from as civil as they present themselves to be, and are more than willing to get their hands dirty in order to dispose of those who threaten their polished image. You do understand what I am saying, right? Christoph's gaze became grim when he heard these words. His wife did not have the intellect necessary to understand what Heidi was alluding to, but he sure did. Men would be coming for him and his family because of what he had done, and now he would need to defend them, much in the same way Bruno had done for his own bloodline. It was after saying this that Heidi drank the rest of her tea and paid the tab before standing up. As she was about to walk away, she gave one final bit of advice to Christoph before departing. You should know, though you may not be on the best of terms with my husband, he has made ample preparations to defend those who are close to him. If you need a helping hand, Bruno has people in his service who are experts at dealing with these kinds of problems, discreetly. But you should be aware the price to be paid for using their services will weigh on your conscience, assuming you have one, that is. If you wish to know specifics, you should look at today's headline in the paper. After saying this, Heidi departed with Erwin, not taking a second glance back at her brother-in-law, who himself was quick to unravel the newspaper on their table, where he read the headline aloud, albeit in a hushed tone. Massacre in Berlin. The mysterious murder of von Bleikroder family. Upon seeing the title of the headline, Christoph would read about the prominent family of bankers being slain within their household. And though the dots had not been connected by the publication, it was clear to Christoph that this was a similar situation to what had happened to the Rothschilds in Austria and England not long ago. Bruno was going after bankers. But why? Why was he massacring the entire family lines of these wealthy families? Was it to shut down the competition to his own banking institutions? No, that was most certainly not the case. Christoph may not be close to his youngest brother, but he knew very well that the man only acted in violence out of defense of two things: his family and the fatherland. Regardless of the man's reasons, Heidi was outlining exactly what she meant. If he were to make use of Bruno's assassins, he would have to live with the guilt of murdering entire families on his mind. The question was, could he handle such a thing? Of course he could. Just like with Bruno, there was no price too steep when it came to protecting one's loved ones. Chapter 342. An Unconventional Surrender. The Kingdom of Italy had found itself in a remarkably poor position following Bruno's rapid advance through its northernmost regions. Hours was all it took for the German army and its allies to seize their objectives. It was entirely possible that the Italian soldiers defending those regions did not even fight, and instead rose the white flag the moment they made contact with the enemy. And by the time a treaty had been agreed upon, this was proven to be true in multiple cases. Take Milan, for example, where Bruno and his soldiers had advanced from the Alps down to their beloved and ancient city. The Italian soldiers threw down their rifles and waved the white flag the moment they saw the thousands of armored vehicles rolling their way. Why was this the case? Because they knew fighting against 10 tanks was pointless, let alone 1,000 of the damned things. They had no weapons that could properly damage them, and the Allies' tank corps was currently located on the borders of France and Germany, fighting its way through the German control over southern Belgium, and suffering extensive losses as they did so. Having not quite lost enough men to be experiencing the delusion that came with the sunk cost fallacy, and having no real enmity with the Germans and Austrians that compelled them to advance forward to their doom against a superior enemy like madmen, the Italian commander simply decided to surrender the moment they saw the Germans advancing towards them. The Italian commander literally welcomed the Germans into his territory with open arms, basically claiming that he had no intention of fighting them, as he was well aware of what they had done at the border. Offering Bruno a cup of wine and a pack of cigarettes, which Bruno rejected, the field officer tasked with the defense of Milan went on and on about how foolish it was for Italy to get involved in this war when they had just made major gains in North Africa a few years prior. His exact words were, "I can't believe our king was foolish enough to intervene in this conflict on behalf of the French and British. I mean, what in the hell have they done for us lately?" Sure, the alliance with Germany and Austria didn't quite pan out as intended, but whatever grievances lie between our kings and your emperors shouldn't have been great enough to jump at the chance of war. Damned foolish indeed. Bruno walked with the protection of an entire squad of his own men around him. He was quick to counter the officer with his own take on why the Italians had joined on behalf of the Allies. Not foolishness, but greed. Humanity's worst instinct, and the one that we are so easily controlled by. Your king saw this war as an opportunity to seize Austro-Hungarian lands by using the British and French support they received to do so. If I'm being honest, he would have been much better off saving up his forces to attack Ethiopia. It is the only African nation left untouched by colonialism and is a much easier conquest than Austro-Hungary. Unfortunately, he would rather contend with us over disputed territories in Europe, territories which are neither ethnically, linguistically, or culturally Italian. So, maybe there was a bit of foolishness driving his actions after all. Anyway, as long as you and your men remain peaceful, I see no reason to confine you in a prisoner of war camp. This is your city, after all. I would very much appreciate you all keeping the peace on our behalf. We won't be here long, anyway. As we speak, our leaders are reaching a peace treaty that will end this senseless bloodshed once and for all. So tell your men that so long as they don't fire upon us, or our allies who may be within the vicinity of the region, they are free to keep their arms and act as gendarmes until a peace can properly be brokered. But if violence does occur, for whatever reason, the trust one am placing in you all will be broken, and there will be severe consequences. Do you understand me? The Italian commander was surprised that Bruno had come to Milan as a conqueror, and yet had no intentions of disarming the garrison or imposing his will on the people within it. It would appear that Bruno was so confident that some form of peace would be achieved within the next few days at the latest that he had no interest in doing anything that would waste his time and resources. As a result, the Italian commander was quick to accept these terms. I would be a damned fool if I refused such a gracious gesture. I will tell the men that you and your soldiers are not to be treated as enemy combatants, but rather as guests for the duration of your stay, and will remind them of the consequences that come with any act of stupidity. Bruno was quick to nod his head in understanding before clarifying one thing. You have my thanks for your cooperation, but I must state for the record that my men will not be staying here. We will be fortifying our position just outside of the city. As I stated, Milan is yours, and I expect you to keep the peace on your own. Now that this is understood, I will get about my business, and you to yours. We will meet again when I have an update on the status of this peace treaty. God be with you, Colonel. After saying this, Bruno returned to his own forces, which left the city of Milan just as quickly as they had entered it, taking up post just outside of its borders, while the Italian soldiers within conducted their own orders with a level of professionalism that Bruno had not expected of them. Apparently, when it came to the prospect of potential peace, Italian soldiers were far more capable of performing their jobs than when it came to advancing on an enemy position. Who would have thought? Chapter 343, Divine Wisdom or Common Sense. The Kaiser of the German Reich needed to do very little regarding the negotiations between himself and the Kingdom of Italy, as the disputes that existed between them and the Central Powers primarily revolved around claims regarding lands in Austro-Hungary. Fundamentally, the Kingdom of Italy, the House of Savoy, and any other parties with any stake in the game were required to completely withdraw any claims they may have over the disputed lands in perpetuity, specifically those revolving around lands in southern Tyrol and Trient. In addition to this, the Kingdom of Italy was made to pay war reparations in an amount that did not exceed the reasonable. Ultimately, Franz Jospe was wise enough to understand that with gains made in the Balkans, specifically revolving around Serbia, and the already tumultuous nature of the region, adding any more lands to the Austro-Hungarian Empire at this time would be borderline suicidal. Because of this, he ultimately settled for reparations, and the Italians relinquishing claims they had over lands owned by the Habsburgs. It was a wise decision, made by a man who had been an emperor for several decades, and had listened to several personal lectures by a mind he considered to be perhaps the greatest in the world when it came to grand strategy. Over the years, Bruno had maintained close contact with the three European emperors and their families. And personally meeting with the Emperor of Austria was something he had done on several occasions when he was granted the means to do so. In these private meetings, Bruno had spoken of a great variety of topics. As a well-educated man with a vast library of knowledge from past, present, and future embedded within his grand archive of a brain, Bruno could speak like a preacher with divine knowledge regarding the subjects he was so familiar with. A preacher who the most wise would listen to and treat his word as if it were gospel itself. These discussions had reached topics such as overextension and the difficulties with maintaining the stability of an empire like the one the Habsburgs ruled. Bruno was a man, after all, whose tongue was slightly loosened when he partook of drink. Not even to give away critical secrets, but enough to impart what he believed to be common sense, but in reality was profound wisdom to those around him. Hence why Franz Joseph was hesitant to push for a punitive peace and to seize any lands from Italy. The Austrian emperor would never forget the almost bitter expression on Bruno's face when they shared drinks together many years ago, the look in his eyes that was filled with scorn as he spoke of how a peace based upon punishing the defeated in ways that were excessive and humiliating would only inspire further violence in the future. It was a topic Franz Joseph had seldom thought about prior to the discussion he had with Bruno, but one that he took to heart. Thus, he was slightly bewildered when the Italian King Victor Emmanuel III approached him in private after the discussions were concluded and the treaty had been signed. There was an expression of heartfelt gratitude on the Italian king's face as he expressed his thanks in private to the Austrian emperor. I must say, I was dreading this discussion, especially after word reached my ear that the Wolf of Prussia had marched into my lands and captured my cities. I thought for sure once you learned of that you would rake me over the coals. But in all things, you have been most fair to me, my house, and my nation. I feel ashamed for dragging Italy into this war on the losing side, especially over such minor and petty grievances now that I look back upon them with hindsight. The price we must pay is one that can easily be explained to the Italian people, and one that I assure you we will not miss a single payment for. Well, I suppose I should return to my home. Now that this gruesome affair has been concluded, you do after all have a war to win in France, don't you? A war to win in France. It was a thought that made the Austrian emperor sigh with a heavy heart as he thought about how ultimately, despite knocking out Serbia, the Ottoman Empire, and Italy, there were still two more major powers they would have to overcome. It was his highest hopes by the years in this conflict would be over, because it was truly something that had cost far too many lives than it was worth. Churchill's death and the eradication of the Rothschild branch in England had caused major concerns for the United Kingdom. Few wanted to admit it, but war was quickly becoming a real possibility for the British Isles. Irish independence groups were being armed to the teeth by weapons smuggling from across the world, while Marxist revolutionaries and patriotic counter-revolutionaries fought in the streets of London, Birmingham, and other major English cities. The colonies burned through hybrid warfare. Revolutionary groups began popping up in India and Africa, while the German colonial forces, under the command of the Lion of Africa, pushed back against the British and French armies, driving them out of the German colonies and pressing claims for Middle Africa at a rapid rate. With Germany being completely capable of transporting its convoys to and from its colonies, they were more than capable of supplying the colonial forces with the weapons and ammo they needed, giving them an enormous boost which they did not have in Bruno's past life. And as the German Marine Corps underwent its first deployment, some 45,000 German naval infantry were sent to Africa to gain some combat experience before the planned invasion of the British Isles was actually considered feasible. Finally, the Imperial Japanese Army combined with the Royal Thai Army ravaged British colonial possessions in the east. It was a terrible time for the British Empire. So many fires burned across their empire, and yet for every one they tried to stamp out, another two were lit in their place. All the while, the bulk of their forces were still trying their best to aid the French in pushing through Belgium. hundreds of thousands of Anglo-French soldiers dying with each mile of land gained. It was a disaster of epic proportions, and when Italy finally announced its surrender, before the Alpine theater could even truly begin, defeatist sentiment spread like napalm across the British homeland. The war was over, the Allies had lost miserably, and now the people demanded to withdraw and leave France to its deserved fate. But would the British government really give up now, after all they had lost in this war with nothing to show for it? That was the question among those who stood within the hallowed halls of the British Parliament, arguing like madmen about how to proceed with this empire-ending crisis they found themselves in. Chapter 344, Kneel Before the Crown. The British Parliament was in an uproar it had not seen since the American colonies had successfully defeated their colonial forces via a combination of asymmetric and regular warfare. At the time, one of the larger grievances had been the uncivilized manner with which the colonialists conducted warfare. Much was the same sentiment that repeated itself currently as a particularly heavy-set parliamentary member cursed the Germans for the way they waged war, his jowls practically flapping in perfect tandem with his double chin as he did so. It is absolutely reprehensible the way these damned barbarians wage war against our soldiers. Chemical weapons, bombing campaigns from the sky, and ambushes on our non-combatants. We cannot let such acts of uncivilized behavior be permitted to go unpunished. This was a sentiment many among the more hawkish members of Parliament had regarding the German army, the German Reich, and the German nation as a whole. They had gotten molly-walloped so badly over the course of the last 2 years that they simply could not admit that they were defeated by a superior foe. No, it was the uncivilized way in which the Germans conducted warfare. That was how they had so thoroughly trounced the indomitable might of the British Empire. However, the Hawks were starting to become a minority in British politics as the empire burned in the background, and hostility between the various parties and ideologies was at the highest extent imaginable. So much so that one of the opposition was quick to throw his mug of water at the overweight parliamentary member who had suggested continuing the war. The mug struck the man's head and cut him across the forehead, while its contents spilled all over the intended target. Immediately upon hurling the object, the man who had thrown it yelled at the man he struck, "If you're so damned insistent on sending our sons to die in this war, why the bloody hell don't you yourself volunteer first?" This act of violence in the halls of Parliament sparked a full-scale riot as all sides began throwing things at one another and engaging in fisticuffs in the middle of the building. All the while the men at the top of the hierarchy face-palmed and wiped their eyes in exhaustion. Three times in the last 72 hours the British Parliament had erupted in violence as those on both sides of how Great Britain should proceed with the war effort could not come to a single concession. One side wanted to withdraw and leave the French hanging dry immediately, while spending their remaining military power to stabilize their own homeland and colonies. All the while the other side wanted to make the Germans pay for killing over 1 million of their young men. British casualties in this war were far higher than in Bruno's past life, nearing 3 million in total that were Kia, WIA, or MIA. And the French were even worse. The Italians who hugged their own borders and were quite reserved in their assaults, so much so that their Anglo-French allies often criticized them for not taking the war seriously, had suffered the least amount of casualties of any major power, that being less than 500,000 Kia, WIA, and MIA combined. And now they had raised the white flag and surrendered, which meant exactly what the British feared most. The Wolf of Prussia and his 8th Army would be marching on France soon. Very soon. The time to get out of the war before the final battle began was a very limited window, and with each passing second that they could not agree upon a solution, that window was rapidly closing. And now, despite all of this, the Parliament of the British Empire behaved like a pack of rabid jackals, trying to tear each other's throats out. As a result, there were attempts to restore order as shouts were made to cease their hostilities at once. Order! Order! I will have an order! The violence, however, continued until, that is, the great doors of the Hall of Parliament opened to reveal the regal form of King George V, who stepped forward with a haughty gait in his step. The man was dressed in full regalia, something that was far more ceremonial even in this day and age than anything else, and was surely enough to capture the attention of all those present. Even those who were holding their peers by the scruff of their neck and their fists raised quickly released their grips and tried to make themselves respectable for the king, who walked down the halls of Parliament for the first time in recent memory. And then, as the sound of King George's steps suddenly came to a stop, and he stood at the podium, he made a shocking announcement to the British Parliament and by extension the British Empire at large. Empowered by ancient decree, I, King George, fifth of my name, use my royal prerogative to dissolve the Parliament here at once. Since none of you can come to an agreement on how this critical matter shall be settled, I, King of Britain, and bestowed the divine right to rule by God himself, shall settle this matter. You may all go home now and rethink your lives, and perhaps as you do so, you will reflect on how you have all lost the faith and will of the people. After saying this, King George left the hall without saying another word, leaving the members of Parliament confused, as there were many among them who did not understand this was a right of the British monarch that he held with constitutional authority, and his will would be done regardless of what these petty thieves who called themselves representatives of the people thought about it. It was time for the British people to kneel before the crown and let the monarch settle his dispute paid in full with British and German blood once and for all. A sentiment that if Bruno saw perhaps would have brought a tear to his eyes, as he had so very much wished to see a similar scene play out within his past life. Chapter 345, Divine Judgment. The world was changing. Empires that had existed and expanded for centuries were beginning to become buried beneath the sands of time. The Ottoman Empire was dead and gone, its banners burned, and its heroes forgotten. In its place, Turkey arose from the ashes, but within borders much smaller and more insignificant than it would have held in Bruno's past life. The Arab peoples had negotiated a united kingdom in the lands they were promised. The Levant, Syria, Palestine, the Sinai Peninsula, and Arabia proper all united under one king and one religion. Persia had wisely watched the great powers wage war against one another, and was perhaps the only nation that was not suffering from some form of internal turmoil, and thus incapable of joining for said reasons that wisely understood this was a war that would destroy the balance of power in this world. And thus as a minor power they kept entirely to themselves, not making any serious gains, nor losing anything they currently possessed as a result. The banners of the rising sun had been waved over the lands east of the Himalayas, and mountains of bodies lie in the field from those who defended against the relentless onslaught of Japan. Though only the Allied colonies were attacked at this time, considering any sovereign nation in the region or any land that was controlled by another European power was not worth provoking at this time. As previously stated, the world was changing, but Bruno was the same as he always was. With the Italian theater having concluded before, it could truly kick off in any extravagant fashion, as he very much expected it to. Bruno was sitting in a city in Milan. One could tell by the extravagance of his uniform and the medals which were dangling from his neck and pinned to his chest that he considered himself in a peaceful zone. And that was most certainly true. The peace agreement between the Central Powers and Italy was most fair, more fair than the Italians expected it to be. At the same time, the Italian soldiers in Milan controlled the city, while the German soldiers were using the local railways to pack up their things and ship them back to Germany. Bruno himself decided to use this time to explore Milan, a city of ancient renown, prestige, and beauty. The locals did not seem to mind the enemy general walking among them. In fact, several of the women he had come across had tried to entice him, an offer he was inclined to reject. Even his waitress couldn't help but flirt with the man as she stood in front of him, asking him with a forcefully coquettish tone what was so interesting in the papers, as if to imply something far more desirable was already in front of him. Is the news really so interesting that you can't take your eyes off of it for a second? Bruno's eyes had not diverted in the slightest as they continued to read line after line of the article in front of him. Sure, the waitress was an attractive young woman, but he was a married man, and would not jeopardize the loving relationship he had with his wife for a single fling in some foreign country. He was, after all, a man of supreme discipline, and thus his voice was callous and cold as he responded to her attempts to provoke a gaze at her obviously and purposefully partially unbuttoned blouse. I assure you, the fact that the King of England has dissolved Parliament is of far more interest to me than anything else at the moment. After saying this, Bruno tapped his ring finger 3 times on the table, as if to subtly hint that he was not the least bit interested in his waitress's advances, just in case his words did not get through her obviously thick skull. As a result, the woman sighed heavily and filled up the man's coffee before departing from the scene entirely. Just as she did so, Heinrich arrived and sat down in front of Bruno, handing him a newspaper that had a separate headline on it. The headline suggested that the killings of the family of industrialists in Germany were connected to the deaths of the Rothschilds and the others who had been being murdered off by the dozen as of late. Heinrich was not the least bit pleased. In fact, he was quite livid as he pointed directly at the headline and accused Bruno of being responsible for them, albeit indirectly. This was fucking Eric, wasn't it? All of these mass murders that have been happening across Germany and Austria. This is what he has been up to this entire time. Bruno's eyes looked up from his own article and narrowed themselves upon his friend's accusatory stare. He did not make a single facial expression as he sipped from his coffee before answering Heinrich's question with one of his own. If I were to tell you that our mutual friend has gone AWOL and I don't have the slightest idea what he has been up to since, then would you believe me? The look on Heinrich's face was one, as if he was about to physically explode from anger and take everyone else out in the little diner they were sitting in with him. He knew Bruno well enough by now to know that this was indeed his way of admitting guilt without actually saying anything criminal. Yet he couldn't say anything. At least not anything he truly wanted to say. No, Heinrich could only sit there and calm himself for some time, fuming silently as he did so. That is until Bruno pushed a plate full of a local pastry towards him. His words were not the slightest bit reassuring as he did so. You need not concern yourself with whatever that man is up to. And if anyone asks about him, you are better off stating the honest truth, and that is that you haven't seen him in some time, and you don't have the slightest clue where he is or what he is doing. Because if your accusations are true, and that little pup has slipped his leash and gone on a murder spree, well then it would be a damn good thing that you had no knowledge of this matter, none at all. Now wouldn't it? Heinrich, having slowly begun to think through what Bruno was saying, and how best to seek answers without saying anything that could potentially be used against him, was quick to ask his next question when he realized how best to put it forth. I mean, I don't understand. Why bankers? And why their entire family? Not just the bankers, but their wives and children, and their grandchildren too. Why would anyone do this? Bruno then handed a slight newspaper article to Heinrich from his own paper. It would appear that the authorities finally realized the sailors who would have started the Kiel mutiny, who were ambushed in their transports, were assassinated, and not a casualty of war, which made the headline of an article deeper in the paper. When Bruno handed this to Heinrich, he was very careful in the words he chose. Lots of people other than bankers are being killed these days. It's a time of war and chaos, and perhaps these men have all made a common enemy. Or perhaps someone is getting rid of those who are most likely to stab us in the back when we are at our nearest to total victory, and in doing so, preventing them from having the opportunity to begin with. If this were to be the case, then it would make sense to get rid of their families, too. Because when pulling weeds from the soil, one must take out the entirety of the root. If not, it will be back before long, and with a vengeance at that. Heinrich stared in disbelief at Bruno's words for a long and horrid silence. His lips quivered as he tried to voice the words stuck in the back of his throat. That is until Bruno interrupted him with a sinister smile on his face. I know what you're thinking, Heinrich. These men aren't guilty of anything, let alone their families. What kind of monster could possibly judge them for sins they have yet to commit? But that's where you're wrong, my friend. We are all guilty. Ultimately, we will all be judged for what we have done in this life. The only difference is, these sinners have been sent to their Maker ahead of schedule to receive God's divine judgment. Bruno then stood up and opened his wallet, pulling out some of the local currency which he placed upon the table, along with a decent tip. He then began to walk away when Heinrich called out to him, suddenly emboldened to speak his thoughts without restraint, as if possessed by the Holy Spirit itself. And what happens the day someone thinks that you deserve to see God's divine judgment? Huh, Bruno? What then? Bruno turned around when he heard this. For the first time since Heinrich began speaking to him, he showed the first slight of emotion. It was a smirk, neither sinister nor conceited, but wholly frightening. The tone in Bruno's voice, however, was eerily devoid of any expression as he actually stated his thoughts on the matter before walking off entirely. Should that day come, then all I can say is that they better not miss. Chapter 346. What is the price of a mile? Rain fell upon the landscape of northwestern Belgium. The sky had been blotted out by the black storm clouds, which were welcomed in a torrential downpour of epic proportions. The only illumination which could be witnessed by the men huddling under the cover their trenches provided for them was the burning husks of Allied tanks, which had tried and failed to push against the fortifications which the German and Belgian soldiers used as cover. These ruined machines of war lie sunken halfway into the mud beneath them, as the downpour continued to create pools of water throughout the landscape, turning the now barren and lifeless landscape into a marsh filled with nothing but the drowned corpses of the recently departed. The charge had failed, miserably so, as the soldiers of the Central Powers bravely stood their ground and obliterated 500,000 men in the course of a day. And now the sound of guns echoed in the distance as the counter-battery began. While the King of England had sought for a peaceful resolution to this war, the fighting still waged. And among the dead marshes were soldiers of the British Empire, along with those from their French allies alike. The pitter-patter of the rain dropping upon the steel helmets of the Allied soldiers who had survived the initial assault was drowned out by the echoes of machine guns and artillery alike. Their cries, as they were covered in mud and blood, muffled by the symphony of war, as the Germans and Belgians continued to gun down those who were unfortunate enough to still draw breath, yet be caught in between a sea of corpses and the enemy lines. The conditions for the Third Battle of Ypres, better known by the name of Passchendaele, had come a year earlier than it was supposed to. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm raged without mercy, turning the hellish landscape already battered and bruised by years of warfare into a nightmarish swamp filled with mud, blood, and the festering disease of rotting bodies. A land once renowned for its natural beauty had become the most heinous bog ever to be witnessed by men, and the soldiers on both sides dare not rush into the middle of it, for fear that the dead would drag them into its depths by their ankles, to join them forever in eternal agony. Rain continued to pour, blood still spilled, and bullets maintained their trajectory. All the while the Allied commanders, especially the British generals who feared that their king would end their empire's involvement in the war without their chance to earn glory, were ushering their soldiers towards the front line for a second and more bloody assault. 500,000 men had lost their lives in this pitiful and grim hellscape over the course of the last 3 days, their bodies left to rot in the bog that lay before them. And now the survivors were being asked to charge once more? For what? What could possibly justify such a callous waste of human life? Also, the Allies could gain a mile, maybe 2. How much was the price of a mile truly worth? Were such pitiful gains valued at the expense of 1,000,000 men? More? At what point did the Allied soldiers, who continued to suffer disproportionate casualty rates with every command followed, say enough is enough? When would they turn their rifles on the petty psychopaths who dared to call themselves generals? Well, that was a question that was silently permeating in the thick and putrid air as the French and British soldiers pondered whether or not their fear of being shot by a firing squad was worth obeying the orders, which would most certainly end with them drowning in the water that was by now contaminated with the blood, bile, and decay of their former comrades. Sun Tzu once was quoted as having said, "Throw your soldiers into positions, once there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight." But this was not an option where there was no escape. The path to freedom lay behind these men, and the only thing standing in their way was the chain of command which so ruthlessly and recklessly demanded they die for nothing. All it would take for a mutiny of the most epic proportions to break out here at Ypres was for one man to raise his rifle and shoot a superior officer in the head. But likewise, all it would take for these sheep to run off a cliff and to their most certain deaths was for one of them to take the first step over the wire. Which would it be? Nobody knew, nobody cared to guess, and few thought of disobeying orders. Not in this day and age. Ultimately, as the British general in charge of the Ypres operations began shouting at his men to cross over the top and run towards the enemy into a suicidal charge, it was the most unlikely of men who dared to stand up to him and refuse his orders. Charles de Gaulle gazed upon the pathetic state of the Allies. To say their uniforms no longer resembled their original colors and patterns was an understatement. They were tattered and stained beyond recognition. No bolts of vibrant cloth were pinned to any of their chests, no proud displays of valor on the field of battle. Their helmets were dinted, and scraped in ways that even the thick coating of mud, blood, and oil which stained them could not conceal, while there was not an ounce of flesh untainted in a similar manner. These men were battered, and if the tears which washed down their tormented expressions were anything to go by, they were broken as well, and he would no longer stand by any longer and continue to be complicit in their suffering. As a result, the French brigadier general stepped forward and said the words that shocked everyone present. "If you're so hungry for glory, then go prove your courage and step over the wire yourself. Lead the charge and show these men that they are being led by a lion. If not, then shut the hell up. We have lost enough men already to the Germans and Belgians, and I would not see any more of my men die for the sake of your vain pursuit of valor." The British general did not say a word. He was so stunned by the gall of this Frenchman that he had found himself completely at a loss for word. As for Charles de Gaulle, he turned around and walked in the opposite direction, heading back to the area where his quarters were located. He was tired, not physically, but mentally and spiritually, and he sincerely doubted that sleep would cure what ailed him. But he would attempt to do so nonetheless, because he was out of options at this point. Chapter 347. Rewarded beyond one's greatest imaginations. The transfer from Milan to the Western Front was one that would require a lot of moving parts and time to do so. As a result, the 8th Army, who had engaged in most of the fighting up until this point, had been ordered a brief leave of absence. This gave time to the King of England and his cousins Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas II of Russia to reach some form of understanding regarding Britain's future in the war. The Battle of Ypres itself had frozen, leaving Bruno time to return to the fatherland and gain some much-needed rest. Bruno, unencumbered by past trauma and the grim darkness of war, had a rather excitable expression on his face as he stepped off the train in Berlin, only for it to vanish completely the moment he realizes that the first person to gain his attention was a member of the general staff, an adjutant to General Ludendorff, who had replaced Paul von Hindenburg after the debacle that was his plans to entrap and obliterate the Allied army using Luxembourg as the bait. Despite this man being a subordinate of another general, he was not currently acting on behalf of his current master. Instead, the invitation that the man was tasked with giving Bruno belonged to the House of Hohenzollern, more specifically its current master, who demanded to speak with Bruno as soon as possible. Not one to keep his liege waiting, Bruno sighed heavily and shook his head before speaking an old expression as he marched to the palace where the Kaiser and his family resided. "So the chickens have come home to roost, eh?" Bruno figured this royal summons was about the shit he pulled in the Alps, faking radio communications to continue with his assault, and in doing so ignoring direct orders from the crown. But the moment he stepped into the Kaiser's personal study and saw the man sitting in his seat with 2 drinks in his hands, quickly standing up to hand Bruno one while proposing a toast to another victory, Bruno realized he had completely misunderstood the Kaiser's intentions, especially as the man began to speak. "To a glorious victory over the least of a great power. Though Italy may be among the least of the great powers, they still are a great power, nonetheless. You should be proud of what you have accomplished. 2 theaters of war concluded in 2 years, countless enemies slain, and the nations broken by your fortitude and will. Your abilities in the field can no longer be denied, even amongst your most harsh critics. And no doubt, this is one of the reasons I have summoned you here to see me so soon after returning home from war. Do forgive me for delaying your much-awaited reunion with your beloved family, but I'm afraid these matters can no longer wait. Please sit. There is something I wish to show you." Kaiser Wilhelm II then opened up a small jewelry case to reveal the greatest and most desirable military decoration which the German Reich was capable of granting a soldier. It was the star of the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, an award that only one man in history prior to Bruno had ever been granted in this life. That man was General Feldmarschall Gebhard von Blücher, who had led the Prussian forces which aided in the defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo. In Bruno's past life, Paul von Hindenburg was also granted this honor as the only other man to ever be awarded it, for his victory over the Russians in 1917 during the Great War. A victory that would never come to pass in this life as a result of Bruno's interference in the timeline. To earn this grandest of honors, Bruno had to defeat the Serbians, Albanians, Bulgarians, Ottomans, and Italians in 2 separate theaters of the greatest war in human history up to this point. Just going to show that he was living life in hard mode compared to his forebears. As a result, Bruno's hands damn near shook as he saw the award. That, when combined with all others, would grant him the status as perhaps Germany's greatest general in its 2,000-plus long-year history as a distinctive culture and people. And just when Bruno was about to touch the medal he so coveted above all others, the last desire of his current collection, the Kaiser snapped it shut and began to speak of what Bruno had perceived were prerequisites. You have earned this distinction greater than any other man in history. Even the legendary Gebhard von Blücher would have to concede to this undisputable fact. Your talents in military affairs are by far your most well-known trait. But I understand you are quite the statement on top of being an exceptional mind for science, art, and business. After this war is over, I intend to name you Prince of Alsace-Lothringen. Don't get me wrong, I understand you have no desire to rule long-term, nor to put your family in such a position. It is largely ceremonial, as the one I gave to Bismarck before you. But unlike Bismarck, yours will be hereditary. As you will be a proper German prince, I feel it is time to ask you a serious question regarding the future of our 2 houses. Your daughter Eva, I hear, will be turning 15 soon. In a few years, she will be eligible for marriage. I would have her be the future bride of my grandson, Wilhelm. What do you think? Bruno was stunned beyond words. The Kaiser had just offered to give him 3 things most men would covet above all. First, he would be granted the single greatest military decoration in the Kingdom of Prussia, and by extension the German Empire could grant a military officer. Second, he would make Bruno a prince within the German Reich, which meant far more to Bruno than any of his other noble statuses. And thirdly, he offered to make Bruno's beloved daughter the future Kaiserin of the German Reich. As the grandson the Kaiser was mentioning was the son of the Kaiser's eldest son and current crown prince. As a result, Bruno was frankly at a loss for words, and was desperately trying to think through all the potential futures this monumental shift in the timeline would result in. Because of this, utter silence remained for the longest of time before Bruno would finally speak his thoughts about the matter. Chapter 348, A Vision for a Greater German Reich. A million thoughts flashed through Bruno's mind in the span of a mere 5 seconds. Everything from the effects this offer of betrothal would have on the impact of his family, his daughter's well-being, and the greater implications it could have on the world and the timeline at large. The Kaiser was trying to tie Bruno to his own family in perpetuity, as even in this era, family came first, and thus was a means to secure allegiance from powerful and talented figures. It was a bold move, especially since Bruno was of far more humble origins. As for the boy in question, who was to be his future son-in-law, Bruno's opinion of him was quite stellar. In his past life, he had forsaken his family ties after the Kaiser was deposed to marry a woman of far lesser standing, because the Kaiser did not give his blessing due to the nature of her heritage. However, judging by the fact that Prince Wilhelm met this woman at university in the 1920s and was currently younger than Eva by 5 years, this position could easily be usurped by Eva with no form of reluctance on the Prince of Prussia's part. Either way, if the young prince cherished Bruno's daughter as much as he did his own wife during his past life, then it was a very good match for Eva. The difference between Eva and this other woman who Prince Wilhelm would not naturally meet for many years was that Eva was now a grand princess thanks to Bruno's actions, and thus despite their family's recently establishment, they were of proper standing for such a marriage. As Eva's father, it was Bruno's responsibility to ensure she married a good man who would treat her right, care for her financially, and help raise their children. And there were few better options among the higher echelon of nobility than the young Prince Wilhelm. Because of this, he was more inclined to agree. But there were, of course, other factors to consider. Tying himself to the Hohenzollerns, openly here and now with a public announcement of betrothal, would create some hostility with the Romanovs and Habsburgs, who until now Bruno had managed to bind together with Germany as a result of his heroic feats in battle on their behalf. Even now, the Romanovs and Habsburgs wanted to draw Bruno away from the German Reich and to their lands, and have done everything short of the betrothal to do just that. In addition, there was another cause for concern. Bruno did not want to rule over Alsace-Lothringen as its prince. The land was as French as it was German, and the process of re-Germanization would be a long and brutal one. In addition to this, putting the Wolf of Prussia directly on the border with France and in control of the lands that were behind their revanchist desires was a provocative act, one that would ensure another war down the line. Because of this, Bruno was quick to try to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, as he addressed this issue and the other. Betrothing my daughter to your grandson is an honor that I have no objections to, though I must confess I feel a bit unworthy. Rather, my fears lie in the act of giving me and my family dominion over Alsace-Lothringen. This will be an act that no doubt has deep and troublesome consequences further down the line. But if you require me to maintain royal status within the German Reich in order for this betrothal to become official, I have a counter-proposal if you're willing to listen to it. Knowing that Bruno was a man who thought 30 steps ahead of his opponent, whether in a friendly negotiation, a game of chess, or on the battlefield, the Kaiser would be lying to himself if he said he was not the least bit curious what the man had in mind, and thus he was quick to give Bruno permission to do so. Speak your mind. I want to hear this proposal of yours. Bruno took a sip from the drink that the Kaiser had poured him for the first time since sitting down, as if to loosen his tongue a bit, as he began to speak of his thoughts regarding the current discussion. I'll be frank with you. With Italy out of the war, and Britain trying its best to negotiate a ceasefire between them and the Central Powers, we can march into France and seize Paris by the time the snow begins to fall over the Alps. Few things in this life I would state with absolute certainty, but I can guarantee you this. By this year's end at the very latest, our enemies will fully capitulate. The only thing that could prevent that would be the American elections. But even if Woodrow Wilson is elected, he will not assume power until January of next year, and I can promise you the war will end by then. The concerns I have are regarding what comes after. If I am being completely honest with you, and am able to truly speak freely without formality, then let me say this. The Balkans are a shit magnet of the highest order. It will light itself aflame the moment the Allies capitulate, and when it does, the Habsburgs won't be able to hold on to it. They overextended themselves and sent millions of men of different ethnicities and religions to fight in their stead. Austria will be ripe for the taking, as will Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Silesia, Bohemia, Moravia, Carniola, and the rest of the Kussenland. Any remaining regions that are historically, culturally, and linguistically German can also be taken by force if needs be. As for the others who currently live in these places, Italy has already agreed to relinquish their claims over Austrian lands, and they can be persuaded to accept the remaining Italian-speaking peoples of those regions as refugees from the wars that are to come. The Czechs can be peacefully reminded of their German heritage, much in the same way Alsace-Lothringen is currently being. The same goes for Luxembourg. And when it comes to the Slavs in the Kussenland, they can be peaceably reunited with their brothers and sisters in whatever country forms from the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that is bound to occur. It is a bold opportunity to create a much larger and more powerful German empire. And what I want is Tyrol. I am sure I can convince the Habsburgs to be the man who maintains the peace between you and them. I will relinquish any claims my family has over Transylvania and give its control to a local nobleman. In exchange, I will demand from you both to be named the Grand Prince of Tyrol, which will be composed of the lands historically associated with Tyrol, Vorarlberg, and Liechtenstein. And in doing so, I will marry my daughter Elsa off to a member of the Habsburg line. This way, the Austrians can finally join their rightful place in Germany proper, and the Habsburgs can fully submit to your rule. No doubt by the time they realize what is happening, their dreams of being emperors will be fully crushed. When they understand, their only path is to join with the rest of their fellow Germans in a proper nation-state. They will kneel before you as all the other German monarchs have thus far. And when that happens, Germany will own the land, seas, and skies, as we will have ports in the Baltic, the North Sea, and the Mediterranean. So, what do you think of my proposal? Wilhelm was speechless for several moments. He was wise enough to understand what was happening in Austro-Hungary, and the fact that the fires which were lit in this war, and the ones preceding it, could never truly be put out for long. Because of this, he was also aware the end of his allies' reign was coming quickly and would likely succeed in the Great War. But even so, he was skeptical if Bruno could really pull off what he said he could, and thus was quick to ask for his word. If I agree with what you have proposed, and make your family the Grand Princes of Tyrol, can you really accomplish everything you have proposed? Bruno had to fight the urge to smirk as he responded to the Kaiser's question with an honest remark. Well, frankly speaking, if I fail in this regard, then you won't have the authority to do so. Either way, this scenario is contingent on our victory, which I am most certain of. So what will it be? To seize the initiative we have been given and create a greater German Reich together? Or let this opportunity pass us by? When Bruno put it like that, how could the Kaiser possibly disagree with the vision Bruno had outlined for him? He handed the jewelry box with the star of the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross to Bruno and shook the man's hand, formalizing their conspiracy together then and there, while also welcoming Bruno to his family. I suppose in the coming years you will have to abolish your current cadet branch and create a new one, along with a new coat of arms, no? In response to this, Bruno could only smile and nod his head as he voiced the idea aloud. The House von Zehntner Tyrol has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? I suppose it's a good thing the coat of arms of Tyrol is already an eagle, albeit a red one, or I would have to make some serious changes. The two men simply laughed at Bruno's remarks before sharing a toast to their newfound alliance, one that would forever change the landscape of Europe and by extension the world as a whole. Chapter 349. Introducing the E-25 Part 1. The war was rapidly coming to an end. Bruno knew the chaos that would follow in the interwar period. While in his past life the end of the Great Wars was truly the end of Western civilization as the world knew it, in this life, it was very possible that it would be the first nail in the coffin for post-Enlightenment political philosophies. Liberalism, Marxism, and the nascent fascism which had yet to rear its ugly head. The world would be forced to realize that the hierarchical structures that came so naturally to mankind were not so easily replaced after all. In Bruno's past life, he believed the total collapse of Western civilization, which from his perspective as very near prior to his death, would herald in a new dark age, and that would ultimately restructure society back to a more natural state, even if millions would burn in the chaos that followed. But in this life, the failed systems that had brought the world to the precipice in his past life had yet to truly blossom into the dominant ideology that ruled the world. Monarch would win as a result of his actions, and this would cause those more liberal societies like France to break apart and ignite in civil strife. Sure, the Balkans would also become a shit show of the highest magnitude, but that was a common reality for the region. And while political agreements with the Kaiser to secure the future of the German Reich and its status as the global hegemon had been brokered, the forced multipliers that were necessary to achieve this end in practice had yet to do so. Bruno had, like it or not, sparked an arms race between Germany and the rest of the world. Airplanes, tanks, armored vehicles, automatic weapons, submarines, etc. These were all relatively new designs, which Bruno had brought into life far earlier than they should have otherwise been. And if Germany was going to secure its place as the world's foremost military power, they could not rest on their laurels while the rest of the world clawed their way to their newly forged throne. No advancements needed to be made. Anyone who refused to do so was bound to stagnate and eventually be overcome by their rivals, no matter how superior they may be in the present. This was the reality of life, and Bruno had no plans to make such a mistake. Having been granted some free time as the German army prepared itself for the final push into Paris in a major autumn offensive, Bruno decided to begin drafting basic designs for the next generation of weaponry, which he would spend the next few weeks, if not months, of his spare time doing. He had introduced a rather primitive variation of combined arms warfare to the world. And because his enemies on the global stage would no doubt try their best to copy his homework, so to speak, Bruno simply had to up his game. In this life, he had introduced the E-10 as the platform for all of his armored vehicles in the Great War, save for the SDKFZ 251 series of half-tracks. The reason for this was due to its ease of production, modification, and scalability. In addition to the fact that it consumed far less rare earth metals, which Germany was naturally lacking within its borders. In his past life, The Entwicklung series of armored vehicles came in several models based upon tonnage. More or less, they were all the same basic design aside from some minor adjustments like wheel placement and number of. The E-10, which is Panzer I was based upon, was the smallest of these designs, weighing between 10 to 25 tons depending on the overall design. This was a light tank model and was superior to anything else that could have fulfilled the roll-up into 1945 and maybe even just beyond. While Bruno intended to continue production of his variation of the Panzer I for years to come, he intended to lower the volume, as they were only really needed as scout and reconnaissance vehicles going forward. Or in some cases, they could be used as a foreign aid during the coming years. The initial replacement of the E-10/Panzer I would be the E-25, starting with what Bruno would label as the Panzer II. He planned to over the coming years have his engineers perfect his basic sketch. The Panzer II made use of the same rolled homogeneous armor and slope design, but was just scaled up to a length of 5.66 m and a width of 3.41 m. In addition to this, it would be granted an improved engine in order to properly balance the power-to-weight ratio of the larger and heavier tank. The primary gun would be an 8.8 cm KWK-43. This was the powerful gun utilized on the infamous Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausf. B Tiger II, better known by the moniker of King Tiger. In Bruno's past life, the King Tiger was one of the most impressive feats of armor fielded during the Second World War on any considerable scale. However, while the main gun was capable of destroying any other piece of armor in the war with ease, it suffered later on from reliability issues as a result of its complicated production and the deteriorating state of the German industry. This gun, however, was mounted to a superior E-25 chassis via a rounded turret based upon early prototype designs for the Leopard 1M BT, which came in the years after the Second World War had ended. The tank would make use of the armor-piercing composite rigid APCR PZGR-43 shells for its primary gun and would have a coaxially mounted 7.92 by 57 mm MG-34 machine gun for dealing with infantry. Naturally, Bruno did not intend to reveal the existence of the Panzer II to the world for many years to come, as to do so would only further give his enemies ideas on how to compete with him. His hopes were to continue sending Panzer Is in foreign aid to Allied states and in foreign conflicts over the course of the next few decades, while his rivals continued their attempts to improve upon their designs that were already greater than anything fielded during the Great War during his past life. At the very least, Bruno wanted the thousands of Panzer IIs he would produce throughout the latter half of the 1910s, as well as the 1920s, to see service at the onset of whatever future war was to come and still be able to perform at least on a level playing field with the enemy. No doubt, Bruno had plans for the creation of a Panzer III model that was even greater, but these would not be introduced until further developments necessitated their invention. As even currently, the introduction of the E-25/Panzer II would no doubt be stressing the current limitations of German engineering and production of the era. And while the Panzer II was the first of many improvements to armored warfare to come, Bruno had two other armored vehicles in mind to replace his current half-tracks on the front lines of war within the next few years. But first he would have to send these designs back to his companies so that they could properly process and improve upon them, which he was quick to do before ending his work then and there for the day. After all, while the wars of the future were a concern to be sure, they were still relatively distant, and while he was still at home for the limited time he had, Bruno intended to spend the majority of it with his beloved family. Chapter 350. Introducing the E-25 Part 2. After ensuring his blueprints arrived where he desired them to, Bruno spent the rest of the day with his family, but when he was up bright and early on the morrow, he was quick to get back to work. After all, the E-25 chassis could be used to create multiple platforms that would replace the E-10s he already had in existence within the coming years. The German 8th Army was currently serving as an example of future warfare, and while many nations would try to copy its exact layout over the course of the next few years, Bruno was already planning on how to vastly improve its performance. Starting with the introduction of the E-25 chassis and the variations it could make use of, the E-10 self-propelled aircraft guns he currently had in service were very primitive. They were essentially a tank chassis with a slightly modified flak gun bolted onto its top. And while these had proven quite effective at counter-Allied air power thus far, they had a major flaw, and that was the exposure of the men utilizing the guns who sat on top of the tank chassis, without any protection other than the basic gun shield on the flak gun. Mounting a proper armored turret onto an E-10 chassis would have required more time than Bruno had when designing his current SPAG variants, and would be stressing the limits of the platform by adding unnecessary weight. But the E-25, which was more or less an improved version of the Panzer V Panther chassis, was more than suited to handle such a load. And because of this, Bruno designed two distinctive variants to serve as his mobile anti-aircraft platforms. The first design made use of a Zwillingsflak 30 million Malawian Quaches 103 twin anti-aircraft gun in an oscillating turret based upon the infamous Kugelblitz design, which saw limited service during the end of the Second World War of Bruno's past life. While the second design made use of two X-37mm Flak 341 mounted in a Coelian-style turret. With the enemy aircraft Bruno and the German army would face in the coming years, these two designs should be sufficient to deal with any threats posed to a German combined armed force. In addition to this, Bruno began developing designs for self-propelled anti-tank guns and self-propelled artillery, the first of which was what he called the Jagdpanzer. It was more or less a Jagdpanther from his previous life's timeline, but both improved and simplified in design. After finishing his Spags and Jagdpanzers, Bruno drew up a basic concept for a self-propelled artillery, making use of the 15cm SFH-18 field gun. The design was similar to the infamous Hummel system used by Germany during the Second World War of Bruno's past life, but made use of the E-25 chassis and an enclosed turret. The last piece of technology that Bruno would currently be introducing based upon the E-25 chassis was the Schützenpanzerwagen E-25 Katze. This was an infantry fighting vehicle which made use of the E-25 to carry a squad into battle. At the same time, it had a 20mm HS-820 autocannon and turret inspired by the one used on the German Cold War-era Schützenpanzer Lang HS.30 from Bruno's past life. It was his intent to make his battalion tactical groups have two ex-mechanized companies making use of these IFVs, one ex-tank company with the E-25/Panzer II, and finally one ex-motorized company inside his last major design for the day. This design was essentially an armored personnel carrier based on a fusion of the WW-2 German SDKFZ 251 and post-war SBZ-12-3 HS.30. This APC made use of the same overall design of the German SDKFZ 251 enclosed half-tracks that were currently employed in service within the 8th Army, but removed the rear tracks and replaced them with an addition 4x4-wheeled setup, making the vehicle a 6x6-wheeled APC in total. In addition to this, the main weapon mounted on this new and improved wheeled APC was the same 20mm HS-820 autocannon turret being mounted on the previously mentioned Schützenpanzerwagen E-25 Katze, thus simplifying the means of producing these two distinctive armored vehicles, as well as the logistic supply network to support them. Any other additional variations of these weapons could be modified in the future, whether that be the introduction of armored ambulances, command vehicles, engineering vehicles, etc. Currently speaking, creating these variations was not the priority for Bruno, and his corporation's employees were already knowledgeable and experienced in this regard to handle such matters without his direct intervention. As a result, Bruno took one last glance over the basic designs he had spent the last few weeks of his spare time engaging in, before making any edits that he could immediately spot. After doing all of this, he sent these designs over to his engineering team to begin the process of refinement, perfection, prototyping, testing, etc. That was a process of arms development that would take months, if not years' worth of time. Sure, Bruno could give these talented men an overall idea of how the next generation should be made, but when it came down to the fine details of how to actually make them, that was their job and not his. Thus, it would still be another few years before any of these new and advanced weapons entered service. But now that these men had experience designing tanks and their variations, a concept which previously didn't exist, it would be much quicker for them to perfect what Bruno had given them and make a functional product. It was not going to be a 5 to 10 year long project like it had been in his past. especially since the E-25 chassis that most of his new weapons were based upon was simply a scaled-up version of the E-10 already being mass-produced into service. However, although the armored vehicles of the German army's next generation were now officially in the process of development, Bruno would need to do the same for the German Air Force and its Navy, something he had the time to engage in now that he still had a month left before the final campaign of the Great War was to be waged. But while Bruno was developing these basic weapons outlines for his engineers, the other powers were making their moves as well. For example, the King of England and the German Kaiser were now meeting to discuss the future of their two nations and a potential end to the ongoing war between them.